Take a second and look down. Unless you're Walt Disney's frozen head, chances are you're looking at your body. And you think you probably know it pretty well. Well, you're wrong. At least, according to some of the videos I've made on this channel. So this video is a compilation. Now I know, you want new stuff. It's on the way, I promise. It's just we're working on some really big projects right now. Didn't want you guys to think I'd forgotten about you, so here's a little trip down memory lane. Many of these you've probably already seen, but some of them maybe you haven't, because I've made a lot of videos and you have a life. Feel free to throw this on while you're doing things around the house, doing chores like folding laundry, sweeping the floor, cooking dinner, washing the dog 12 times in a row, picking lint out of your clothes, arranging matches, trimming your toenails, organizing your Tamagotchi collection, trimming your neighbor's toenails, doing your daily stretches, washing dishes, filing taxes, trimming your tax collector's toenails, or on a long walk or road trip. Assuming you're not driving, please don't die for this. The point is I give you flexibility. I'll pop up here and there throughout the video to give my thoughts on the video you just watched, or any updates if there are any. But anyway, thanks for being here. Thanks for your patience while I work on these bigger projects. I can't wait to share them with you, I promise. It'll be worth it. But in the meantime, grab a snack, sit back, relax, and just chill out while we start things off with the most horrifying human experiments of all time. Enjoy! When you were in school, did you ever do one of those things where you would prick your finger and then put a drop of blood on a slide and look at it under a microscope? If so, then you took part in a human experiment to better understand our species. Congratulations. You got learnt. Human beings are experimented on every day all around the world. The fact of the matter is you kind of have to. There's only so much that you can learn from a lab. Like right now, we're finally seeing the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, and that was only made possible after testing on thousands of people. So human medical experiments are necessary, but of course they're carried out with strict protocols and stringent ethical standards. This is part of the scientific process, which has been perfected for centuries. But unfortunately, this has not always been the case. Throughout history, there have been examples of horrible medical experiments conducted on humans under the guise of war, national security, or just straight up ethnic or racial purity. In fact, it's debatable they should even be called experiments. The experiments are really just excuses for cruelty. Now, I'm sure in many of these cases, the people who carried out these experiments thought that they were doing a service to the world by finding out knowledge that they couldn't get any other way. But did they? Let's find out as we take a look at some of the most horrible human experiments of all time. Now, before we begin, I need to give the disclaimer that what we're about to talk about in this video gets dark. Like, dark. This honestly might be some of the most disturbing stuff I've talked about on this channel, and I'm the severed head guy. But this stuff actually happened. And this is a good example of just how far down human beings can go. It's worth facing, even if it's uncomfortable. And it's gonna get uncomfortable. Grigory Marianovsky was a Russian biochemist who ran a lab that specialized in poison research. And by that I mean he was finding new and innovative ways to poison people to death. The facility went by several names: Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and Kamera, meaning cell or chamber in Russian, and it was supervised by a high-ranking official named Gingrich Yagoda, not to be confused with Grogu Yoda. But it was Marianovsky who carried out these experiments, and it seems like this was actually a job he was born to do. I mean, his PhD was actually titled Biological Activity of the Products of Interaction of Mustard Gas with Human Skin Tissues. He chose that for his thesis. So he brought that zeal for poisons with him to the lab, where they carried out involuntary experiments on prisoners from the gulags, including chemicals like digitoxin, curare, cyanide, mustard gas, and ricin. Ultimately, what they were looking for was an odorless and tasteless combination of things that could kill somebody without being detected. And they basically put the poisons in vitamins that they gave to the prisoners, so the prisoners had no idea that they were taking poisons at all. That is, until they were unable to breathe or their heart stopped beating. It's literally impossible to know how many prisoners died as a result of this testing, but due to their research, this actually led to some high-profile assassinations in the real world, including Bulgarian dissident Gregory Markov, who was famously killed by a poison pellet to his leg that was administered by a modified umbrella. Yeah, some secret agent literally just jabbed him in the leg with an umbrella as he walked by in the street, and it administered a little tiny pellet with ricin in it. He died in the hospital 4 days later. We still don't know the exact location of the lab because it was kept secret, but a KGB defector in 1954 said that it was near a police station in Lubyanka. In fact, some people think that the lab, or some version of the lab, is still experimenting on people to this very day. But that's the Soviet Union. They're evil. We all know that. The United States would never Oh boy. Yes, shocking, I know, but the United States doesn't come out completely clean in this either. There's a few human experiment programs that happen, including the San Jose Project in World War II. San Jose Island, or Isla San Jose, is in the Gulf of Panama, and in World War II the United States had a base there, and at this base they conducted experiments on how mustard gas affected the human body. On humans. These particular humans were US troops, which were kind of voluntold to do it, which in itself is not that big a deal. I mean, soldiers put their bodies on the line in a million different ways, sure, but what makes this one a little bit sus is how they chose the troops. They did it by race. African American and Puerto Rican soldiers were singled out for these experiments because it was thought at the time that their darker skin would make them more resistant to mustard gas and thus make them more valuable on the front lines in Japan. And Japanese American soldiers were tested on to see how mustard gas would affect enemy soldiers. Around 60,000 enlisted men were experimented on with mustard gas during World War II, meaning we probably gassed more of our own soldiers than we did enemy soldiers. And I should point out it wasn't just minorities that were tested on, white soldiers were tested on in control groups as well. And the soldiers were exposed to mustard gas in 3 different ways. Patch tests, applying liquid mustard gas directly to a subject's skin, field tests, which expose subjects to gas outside in simulated combat scenarios, and chamber tests, literally putting soldiers in a chamber and piping mustard gas inside of it. That sounds horrible. On a quick side note, this buddy of mine was in the Army and he told me all about the basic training and how they put them in the tear gas chamber to make them, get exposed to tear gas so that they understood what it felt like in combat situations. And when he was talking about how it was horrible and it stung your eyes and you were just puking and just snot was flying out of your face and it was the worst experience of his entire life. But afterwards, he said, I've never breathed freer in my life. All the mucus came out of me. And so now every time I get sick and I'm laying down and I can't breathe and I'm all clogged up and everything, I just think, God, just put me in the gas chamber and get it over with, Yeah, mustard gas is way worse than that. Mustard gas causes blisters to form immediately when it touches the skin or the inside of your lungs. This isn't something you just cough out and then you're done with it. This damages things permanently. People who are exposed to mustard gas often come down with things like asthma and emphysema later on because of the damage to the lungs. But even worse than that, it also damages DNA, which leads to leukemia and skin cancers. Mustard gas was first used widely in World War I by the Germans. The gas has a yellow-brown appearance and can smell like garlic, horseradish, or, mustard. And it was after the Germans used mustard gas on Polish citizens in 1939 that the US decided we needed our own stockpile. By the end of the war, we had produced more than 100,000 tons of various types of mustard gas, including 20,000 tons of lewisite, 100 tons of nitrogen mustard, and 87,000 tons of sulfur mustard. The mustard gas experiments were shocking. But what might be even more shocking is how these soldiers were treated afterwards. Despite being told that they would be taken care of afterwards, and despite the permanent injuries they sustained, they still weren't able to get any kind of disability compensation from the Veterans Administration because the tests were carried out in secret. It wasn't until NPR did a report on this in 2015 that the survivors finally had their stories told, and the Department of Veteran Affairs finally stepped in and decided to do something about it. That story won a Peabody, by the way. Of course, it wasn't just Americans that did this. The British also did something with Indian soldiers around that same time, also for the same reasons. They thought that the darker skin would make them more resistant to mustard gas. It didn't, and thousands of Indian soldiers were permanently scarred for life. For the love of God, melanin does not turn you into Wolverine. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began to recruit black men aged 25 to 60 to participate in the study. This study was done in conjunction with the Tuskegee Institute, and most of the participants were picked in the surrounding areas of Macon County, mostly poor and illiterate sharecroppers. Its purpose was to study the natural history of syphilis, how it affected a person over time, and how it spread through communities. And the name of this study was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. People generally just call it the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment now. Fewer syllables. They basically just chose 600 people. 399 of them had syphilis and 201 of them didn't, so they were in the control group. And the idea was they were just going to watch them over a long period of time and see how the disease progressed. Now, there's nothing really all that sketchy about that. It's not like they gave people syphilis or anything. They already had it. And just for context, syphilis is a bacterial infection, and this was pre-antibiotics, so it was untreatable at the time. It is a sexually transmitted disease, so it's usually spread by sexual contact, and it can remain dormant in the body for years before it finally starts to really take over. But once it does, if it's not treated, It's a horror show. People with secondary syphilis break out with rashes and wart-like lesions all over the body, and in tertiary syphilis, inflammatory balls called gummas grow under the skin, on bones, and in organs, causing damage to the heart, the liver, and the brain, which leads to dementia, psychosis, and seizures, and eventually death. So yeah, syphilis was a scourge back then, and really had been throughout all of human history. Especially in militaries, it would just decimate the ranks, and officers were obsessed with controlling the spread of syphilis. In fact, spoiler alert, this is not the last time you're going to hear about syphilis in this video. So to the guys in this study, the die had been cast. There wasn't really any way to treat it, there wasn't anything to do about it, so to them this was just a way to contribute to the scientific understanding of it, and they also got free meals and basic medical care out of it. And all that seems fine, I guess. The problem is, in 1947 they discovered that syphilis can be treated with penicillin, and they just kind of didn't ever tell the people in the study. Yeah, you know that thing that you have that's gonna deform your body and make you go insane? Well, there's a way that we can fix it, but I think we'd rather just see what happens. Yeah, the flawed thinking that led to that decision is the same flawed thinking that led to this whole study in the first place. They thought that the black community was more prone to syphilis infections than other people. Yeah, so that's how the researchers justified the project. They called it a study in nature. And they also argued that they didn't think that they'd be able to talk people in the black community to take the treatments for syphilis. But they also went way further than that. Like, they really went out of their way to make sure that these people didn't possibly get any kind of treatment for their syphilis. They even went as far as to give them fake drugs that didn't actually do anything. So the people in the study thought that they were being treated and, being taken care of, and they weren't. But on top of that, they actually gave lists of the people in the study to all the doctors in Macon County, and they also appealed to the Alabama Health Department to prevent them from getting treated. They were told not to treat these people for syphilis if they came in. And actually, when some of these men got drafted into World War II, and the military tested them and found out they had syphilis, instead of just treating them like they would any other draftee, the researchers got the military to send them back home so that they wouldn't get treated, thus denying them the opportunity to get tested on with mustard gas. These men were allowed to just deteriorate unnecessarily for 40 years. Until 1972, when the New York Times ran a piece about it. At that point, only 74 of the original 600 were still alive. And also in that time, 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their kids were born with congenital syphilis. This led to public outrage and a lawsuit by the NAACP, and in 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act and formed the Office of Human Research Protections to keep this from ever happening again. Remember earlier when I said that the UK tested mustard gas on their own troops? Well, strap in, Brits, because they tested on the general public as well. The Guardian reported in 2002 that the UK's Ministry of Defence turned large parts of the country into a giant laboratory to conduct a series of secret germ warfare tests on the public. These tests took place between 1940 and 1979 and involved deadly chemicals, microorganisms, and an unsuspecting public. They were told the tests were for air pollution and weather research projects. The tests were carried out by Porton Down, which is their biological weapons lab, and actually the oldest biological weapons lab in the world. But the point was to gauge the UK's vulnerability in case the Soviets were to attack with a germ warfare agent. When the story broke, the Ministry of Defense claimed that what they actually used were alternatives to biological agents that were harmless. But many families who had children born with birth defects disagreed. One test that was carried out between 1955 and 1963 involved dumping large amounts of zinc-cadmium sulfide on the general public. Zinc-cadmium sulfide is a fluorescent powder which makes it easy to trace under UV light, and they used it to kind of trace how biological agents might move through the public if it was dumped over people. The problem with that is that cadmium is known to be carcinogenic. There was also a story of a military ship called the Ice Whale that sprayed E. coli bacteria in a 5 to 10 mile radius around England's south coast throughout the 60s. Other experiments outlined in the report include Serratia marcescens bacteria with an anthrax simulant and phenol sprayed in the air in large quantities, bacteria released at lunchtime on the London Underground, and germs attached to spiders' webs in several locations around the country, including in London's West End. Now granted, there may have been some data collected that would have been useful in the event of an attack from the Soviet Union, but that attack never happened. So the only country that actually sprayed biological poisons over the people of the UK was the UK government itself. Yeah, it's all fun and games till the Nazis show up. The Nazis, with all their death camps, had an ample supply of experimental subjects to test on, which they managed over the years to completely dehumanize, basically treating human beings as nothing more than lab rats. Millions suffered under the Nazi regime, but perhaps none so more than twins. Because they were obsessed with racial purity, which led to some twisted and perverted ideas about genetics, and one Nazi doctor in particular thought that he could find all the answers he needed about genetics by experimenting on twins. His name is Joseph Mengele, and he has gone down as one of the biggest monsters in history. When he arrived at Auschwitz in 1943, he was considered one of the top doctors in the country, but he soon earned a new nickname, the Angel of Death. He would scour the incoming prisoners coming into Auschwitz looking for twins, and ultimately he found 3,000 of them to do experiments on. Of those, only 200 survived. Life for twins at the camp was actually better than other people. At first. They didn't have to do any hard labor, they got to go to classes, and they even got to play soccer every once in a while. But then the trucks would come to take them from Mengele's experiments. It would start with measurement tests in which every single part of the twins' body were measured in great detail. This would take hours. And they would then be subjected to, well, basically any crazy idea that Mengele had, including transferring blood from one twin to the other, injecting chemicals in the eyes to try to turn them blue. This would usually just lead to infections or blindness. Injecting diseases like typhus and tuberculosis into one twin and not the other to see what would happen. And if one twin died during this experiment, the other one was killed to compare and examine the disease's effects. Also performing surgeries like amputations, castration, and organ removal without anesthesia. The twins' experiments were, sadly, just the beginning. For example, at the Dachau camp, they did high-altitude tests to try to figure out exactly how high up, say, a German pilot could bail out of a damaged plane. So yeah, they just stuck prisoners in a low-pressure chamber and then just lowered the air pressure until they died. Because science. They also conducted hypothermia tests, basically putting prisoners in cold water and made it colder and colder until they died. And also they did seawater tests, making them drink seawater until they died. At other camps, they infected prisoners with diseases like malaria, typhoid fever, and hepatitis to test treatments on it. At the Ravensbrück camp, doctors conducted bone grafting experiments and sterilization trials, including everything from x-rays to surgeries to drugs, all of them doing psychological and physical damage. The human experiments were just part of the Nazi atrocities that took place during World War II, which led to the Nuremberg Code, which now works as sort of a foundation for ethical human experimentation ever since. It's really hard to imagine a more cruel and inhumane system than the Nazi death camps. But believe it or not, there was one. And it took place at about the same time on the other side of the world. Unit 731 was a Japanese biological weapons testing lab in Japanese-occupied China that opened in 1938, although the Japanese government wouldn't acknowledge the atrocities that took place there until 1984. Lieutenant Shiro Ishii led the operation, which used prisoners of war as well as local villagers as human guinea pigs, or as they were referred to by the researchers, logs. As in, these flesh and blood human beings were nothing more than entries in a logbook to them. So what kind of experiments were done there? Let's just start with frostbite testing. Simply put, the prisoners had their limbs put in ice until they froze solid. The doctors would then try different ways to re-warm the limbs, sometimes putting it in warm water, sometimes just putting it over an open flame. And there were times when the prisoners were just left untreated overnight to see if the blood would eventually warm the limb back up, or just leave them outside in the winter until their limbs fell off. Now, if that's not cruel enough for you, they also performed vivisections. Now, if you don't know what a vivisection is, it's basically an autopsy on a living person. Their reasoning was they wanted to see how diseases like cholera and typhus affected living tissue before it began to decompose. So yeah, they would tie prisoners to a table and remove their organs to examine them while they were still alive. With no anesthesia, of course. And they do crazy things like crush limbs to see how long it would take for gangrene to set in, or amputate a limb and attach it to the other side of the body, real human centipede kind of stuff. Sometimes they would just tie a prisoner to a pole and do weapons testing on them with pistols and machine guns and grenades and flamethrowers. And prisoners were placed in gas chambers to be tested on with nerve agents. Or they would just lock prisoners in rooms without food and water just to see how long they could survive without eating or drinking. Some other experiments included forcing prisoners to only drink seawater, giving prisoners mismatched human or animal blood injections in order to study clotting and transfusions, exposing human subjects to prolonged x-rays which resulted in sterilization and death, and placing humans into centrifuges and spinning them at ultra-high speeds until they lost consciousness or died. And then there were the syphilis experiments. Told you it was coming back. And just like syphilis, it's coming back worse. Way worse. Because in this case, they did actually infect prisoners and then withheld treatment to see how the disease progressed. But they also wanted to study the disease's transmission, which means that they, I've got to say this line. They forced male prisoners with syphilis to rape female prisoners. until they got syphilis. On a similar note, the guards would often rape the female prisoners to get them pregnant, and then they would do weapons testing on them, to see how much differently a pregnant woman responds to getting shot. Or they would give the pregnant woman various diseases and then cut the fetus out to see how it affected the fetus. And last but not least, Unit 731 developed plague bombs by packing plague-infested fleas into clay bomb casings. Japanese bombers deployed the bombs over a Chinese village called Kuzhou in 1940. More than 2,000 people died of the plague there, and another 1,000 died in a nearby town after the plague was spread there by sick railway workers. Unit 731 was disbanded in 1945 after Japan surrendered, and the site was destroyed so that no evidence would be available. The 400 remaining prisoners were shot, but the plague-infested rats were released, eventually killing an estimated 30,000 people across the Chinese countryside. The prisoners were shot to prevent the truth of what happened there from getting out, and the employees of Unit 731 had to take oaths of secrecy. And unfortunately, that seems to have worked. Many of the researchers at Unit 731 just went back to civilian life, no consequences whatsoever. In fact, some of them became prominent members of universities. So this is inexcusable stuff. But the people who performed these experiments, they did have an excuse. They believed, or claimed to believe anyway, that they were gaining knowledge that couldn't be gained any other way. But is that true? I mean, did any good actually come out of all these human experiments? Not really. In the case of the Nazi experiments, the test subjects were not ideal. They were underfed, overworked, overstressed, and in generally poor health. Plus, the experiments were conducted haphazardly, and a lot of the notes that were found and left over were just gibberish. Plus, a big part of the scientific process is being able to recreate tests and get the same results, and those tests that they did at the Nazi death camps, they can't be ethically recreated again, which makes them kind of worthless. But there is something we can learn about the researchers and the psychological mechanisms that make it possible for people to perform such horrible acts. There's a famous psychology study called the Stanford Prison Experiment. I think I've covered it here before, but the general thing that they were trying to figure out was whether brutality amongst US prison guards was because of the personalities that they brought in or the prison environment itself. Student volunteers were randomly divided up into prisoners and guards, and then they were put into a prison situation and just left without any oversight just to see what would happen. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. The prisoners were having emotional breakdowns, and the guards were becoming extremely aggressive and violent, even though none of them had those kinds of tendencies before the experiment started. There's a term called de-individuation. It's when a person gets so wrapped up in a group's norms that they lose all personal sense of self and responsibility. And when this happens, cruel and unusual activities to people who are outside the group lose all meaning to the people who are inside the group, because that's the norm. It's almost like the group is brainwashing itself from the inside out and determining what's right and wrong as a collective. And when this group sees themselves as apart from others, then they tend to dehumanize the other people. They start to not see them as human at all, and then treat them accordingly. I would argue that this psychological tendency and the ultimate results of that psychological tendency are things we should probably keep in mind these days. Big thanks to Brilliant for supporting this video, and to the Answer Files on Patreon and the channel members who help keep things going around here. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more, Google thinks you might like this one, or you can check out any of the others over here with my face on it. And if you enjoy what I do and you want to see more, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. And I think that's it. You guys go out there and have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Well, that was fun. Aren't humans great? This next video was actually the most popular video on this channel for many years. And in fact, many of you have told me that you first found my channel from watching this video, which just goes to show that you're all a bunch of sickos. And I love you. Also, this video was shot like 7 years ago, but I look 25 years younger because apparently being on YouTube is much like being the president. It does things to you. As you will see right now. Did you know the human head weighs 8 pounds? Thanks to the movie Jerry Maguire, I do, and there's no reason to fact check that because this guy looks like he knows what he's talking about. So let's think this through. If an 8-pound head dropped 2 feet down to the ground, it would be traveling downwards at 9.8 meters per second, meaning it would hit the ground with the force of 21.34 joules, or about the same as a baseball traveling at 13.3 miles an hour. This would be the last thing you would feel if your head was cut off by a guillotine. Or would it? Just in case you couldn't tell by the title, this one's gonna be a little dark. The guillotine was basically a device that makes it super easy to chop a dude's head off. Beheadings back in the old days, believe it or not, were considered to be the most humane form of execution. Unlike getting burned at the stake, or drawn and quartered, or crucified, there was no torture element to beheadings. Didn't have any of that good stuff. It was just quick and merciful. Chop, lights out. So it's very important that the process had to be as swift and clean as possible. A dull blade or a bad swing could quickly lead to a game of just make it stop moving. Bad beheadings were basically someone just getting chopped to bits. In fact, it was customary for the more wealthy condemned people to actually tip their executioners to make sure that the blade was sharp and it was all done in one cut. Now, there were machines in Europe to help with this going way back before the guillotine. There was one called the Halifax gibbet. It was basically a sharpened axe blade at the bottom of a weight. But the genius of the guillotine was to put the blade at an angle so that it would rely more on slicing power instead of brute force. By the way, the guillotine was named after Joseph Guillotin, but he was not actually the one who invented it. It was actually a German engineer named Tobias Schmidt who was working with Anton Lewis, who was the physician to the king at the time, who had the idea of using the slanted blade. They named it after Joseph Guillotin because he was the biggest advocate of finding a new, better, more humane method of execution. The guillotine was first used to execute somebody in 1792 in Paris, and it was quickly thereafter proclaimed to be the official form of capital punishment in France. And this thing caught on. People really liked this. Not only did everybody at the time agree that it was the most humane way to go, it was also considered to be a symbol of equality. Before the guillotine, a person from the rich class might get a quick, dignified death, whereas a person from the poorer class would wind up getting hanged in the street. With the guillotine, all things were equal. Everyone from royalty to the lowliest bum all got their heads cut off in the exact same way. Kumbaya, my lord. Then came the Reign of Terror. In the year between 1783 and 1784, literally thousands of people had their heads cut off in public squares by the guillotine during the French Revolution, including the King, Louis XVI, and the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who famously, her last words were to apologize to the executioner because she stepped on his foot while getting on the platform. After the Revolution, the guillotine remained a popular form of execution and entertainment in public executions. Eventually that was taken behind closed doors, but it remained an option for a very long time. The last person to be executed in France by the guillotine was in 1977. That dude listened to disco. The Nazis, always innovators in human suffering, improved on the design in World War II, making it basically a giant cigar cutter with a very short span for it to fall so that they can just pump people through for the most maximum human carnage possible. So as long as there's been beheadings, there's been the question of whether or not you actually remain conscious after that happens, something called lucid decapitation. Participants in the crowds during the French Revolution reported seeing the heads blinking and making expressions, and physicians at the time were beginning to get a better idea of the physiology of the body and the circulatory system, and they began to understand that consciousness would not just go away immediately. It would take a little bit of time for the blood to drain out of the brain. The question is, how long? There were stories of prisoners being asked to blink for as long as possible after the decapitation just to see how long that would last. And there were reports of that going on for up to 30 seconds, but they also didn't know for sure if that was a conscious thing that the person was doing or just some kind of death spasm. One of the most well-documented cases was from a doctor named Dr. Bureau, who experimented with a condemned man named Henri Languille on his execution. This was on June 28th of 1905, and the doctor recorded what happened in his journal. I'm just going to read this for you. Here then is what I was able to note immediately after the decapitation. The eyelids and lips of the guillotine man worked in irregularly rhythmic contractions for about 5 or 6 seconds. This phenomenon has been remarked by all those finding themselves in the same conditions as myself for observing what happens after the severing of the neck. I waited for several seconds. The spasmodic movement ceased. It was then that I called in a strong, sharp voice, "Languille!" I saw the eyelids slowly lift up without any spasmodic contractions. I insist advisedly on this peculiarity, but with an even movement, quite distinct and normal, such as happens in everyday life, with people awakened or torn from their thoughts. Next, Languille's eyes very definitely fixed themselves on mine, and the pupils focused themselves. I was not then dealing with the sort of vague, dull look without any expression that can be observed any day in dying people to whom one speaks. I was dealing with an undeniably living eyes which were looking at me. After several seconds, the eyelids closed again. It was at that point that I called out again, and once more, without any spasm, slowly the eyelids lifted, and undeniably living eyes fixed themselves on mine with perhaps even more penetration than the first time. Then there was further closing of the eyelids, but now less complete. I attempted the effect of a third call. There was no further movement, and the eyes took on the glazed look which they have in the dead. Yeah! So it looks like, by all accounts, you remain conscious for about 30 seconds. So after that guillotine falls and you feel that cold metal against your neck, the ground will rush towards you, You'll hit the floor with the force of a slowly thrown baseball, either on your forehead or your nose or your chin, depending on the cut. Blood will fill your nasal cavities, but you can't blow it out. You'll be in some state of shock as the world spins around and finally comes to a rest, but you won't feel the blood pumping through your ears. And then you'll just sit there, waiting for a long period of time as the tunnel vision sets in and then the lights slowly go out. The brain shuts down throughout the outside of the cortex, first shutting down the sensory and motor cortexes, giving you a feeling that you're not in your body anymore. The last cortex that gets shut down is your memory cortex, which is why people who have had near-death experiences get the feeling of going through and seeing their lives flash before them. So death is less like falling asleep and more like a quick journey through your entire life before you get to your very last memory. And then everything shuts down. Fun! So the moral of the story here is don't get your head cut off because your head will hit the ground and that's gonna hurt. Congratulations, you made it through this video. Yes, that was super dark, but it's an interesting topic and gives you at least some kind of idea of how our brain works. All right, please like and share this if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, I usually talk about much less grisly things. You can check those out in my other videos, and if you like those, please do subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and Thursday. All right, you guys go out and have an eye-opening week. Don't get your heads cut off, and I will see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Remember when an 8-minute video was like really long? So while people in the French Revolution didn't have much hope when they were standing on the guillotine, if such a thing were to happen today, luckily for you, there's a certain Italian doctor you could call. In 2015, Dr. Sergio Canavero, a man who in no way looks like a mad scientist who wants to attempt a human head transplant, announced that he was totally going to attempt a human head transplant. And everyone around him was like,
yeah, I can see him. I told you.
Exactly. Head. And believe it or not, he had a volunteer. The guy's name was Valery Spiritonov. He was a Russian programmer with muscle wasting disease called spinal muscular atrophy, which left him paralyzed and immobile. So yeah, when he heard that somebody was going to attempt a human head transplant, he was like, you know what? Pop this head on something better. Many of you probably already know this story. Hell, I may have already talked about it in a video before. I can't keep up with my videos. But anyway, here we are now. It's been nearly 10 years now, and we really haven't heard much about it lately. So I decided I wanted to revisit the story and you know, take a look at what happened, and then, you know, take a deep dive into the feasibility of this thing. Like, what would you actually need to do to switch out your head? To get the answer, I spoke with Rohin over at Midlife Crisis, who helped put the whole thing into perspective.
You're doing incredible microsurgery on all the tiny structures. So you've got all of that. I mean, there's so much running through the neck. And you've got cranial nerves coming down, the windpipe, the esophagus. Every surgical discipline would need to be contributing to this. It would be a monumental operation.
What happened to Dr. Canavero's crazy dream? Is it actually feasible? What kind of advancements would need to be made to make it happen? And maybe the biggest question, is it a head transplant or a body transplant? The year is 1780. The place is the city of Bologna, and you're an assistant for an eccentric professor named Luigi Galvani, when one day he asks you to bring him a frog for dissection. So you fetch a preserved frog, but when you bring it to him, instead of dissection tools, you see that he's got a series of wires attached to a hand-cranked electric generator. You probably roll your eyes at this because your boss has kind of been obsessed with this new electricity thing for a while. He's been playing around with it, and usually ends up shocking himself. Sometimes on purpose. So you're really not too surprised when he opens up the frog and attaches electrodes to the frog's nerves. You are surprised, though, when he cranks the machine and the dead frog tries to hop. At least it looks like it. The legs pump up and down uncontrollably, causing you to uncontrollably pee your pants. Galvani used this and other experiments to hypothesize that there's a kind of biological electricity that powers animals, including humans. This comes to be known as galvanism, and it leads to a whole field of study for the next few decades. Galvani was kind of right. Human cells do have electrical action potentials, especially nervous system cells, but he was mostly wrong in how it worked. Regardless, this whole idea of being able to control body parts and resurrecting dead tissue with electrical circuits eventually inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 30 years later. Frankenstein, of course, featuring a monster that was constructed with multiple body parts from different dead people, then shocked into existence by a madman.
My name is Frankenstein!
This might have been the first time the idea was put on paper that a person could, put a human head on another human body and bring that body to life, even though transplants wouldn't be a thing for another 100 years. Yeah, it's kind of hard to pull off a transplant in a time before anesthesia when surgeries had to be done as fast as possible. Also, they didn't have antibiotics back then, immunosuppressive drugs, and they didn't even understand different blood types. It would have been a disaster in a million different ways. The first successful organ transplant was a kidney transplant in 1954, but people were actually experimenting with head transplants long before that. In fact, it was way back in 1908 when an American doctor named Charles Guthrie did Okay, so look, I did a video a while back about animals in space that nobody seemed to like because it involved a lot of animals dying, including dogs. Anyway, if you're one of those people and you're a little bit squeamish about that kind of thing, you might want to skip forward a little bit because I'm about to talk about some dog experiments. Basically, Charles Guthrie sewed the head of one dog onto another dog and made a two-headed dog. Horrible as that may be, and it is horrible, it was also a breakthrough of sorts because he was able to prove that you could keep a head alive by connecting it to a source of blood. In fact, he actually later won a Nobel Prize for his research. Not specifically the dog thing, but for his research into transplant stuff, which included the dog thing. But he would not be the last, as Rohin points out.
So the people you're referring to is Vladimir Demikov in the Soviet Union, who was another brilliant pioneering surgeon, but did these, like, he made these two-headed dogs, some of which lived for, a fair amount of time, sort of maybe, I don't want to get it wrong, but maybe a couple of weeks or something like that, and was the inspiration for the MTV2 logo, by the way. Just a little bit of trivia there. And then Robert White in the 60s and 70s was the guy who again was a bit of a Sergio Canavero character, said he was getting close and did a lot of work on monkeys and baboons.
We'll hear more from Rohin here in a minute, but I just wanted to pause for a second and thank him for his time. If you don't follow Rohin, he's got a channel called Medlife Crisis on YouTube. It's also over on Nebula. It's great. It's got medical advice with a healthy dose of humor. It's kind of like what I do, but he's an actual doctor. So yeah, go check him out. But yeah, a little extra context of what he was saying about Vladimir Demikov and his two-headed dog thing. He actually did that experiment over 20 times. He created 20 two-headed dogs. He arranged them in different ways, included more or less of the second dog. Some of them included the entire front half with the legs and everything. There's plenty of footage of this. Obviously, YouTube won't let me show it here. I may show it over on Nebula, but yeah, you can go look it up if you're curious. The other guy Rohin mentions was Robert White. He pioneered the use of hypothermia to keep the brain stable during brain surgery, which has actually saved a ton of lives. And he did head transplants on over 30 rhesus monkeys. These surgeries were sort of successful in that the monkeys lived for a couple of weeks or 8 days or so. They were conscious. They were able to respond to all kinds of stimuli. They had full control of their facial muscles. One of them even tried to bite one of the doctors, I think, understandably. They weren't, however, able to control their bodies. Yeah, White's legacy is fairly complicated because he actually did pioneer some amazing things, and this is something you see from a lot of these people. They're highly respected in their fields as pioneers and whatnot, but there's just something about the head transplant thing that just automatically puts you in the yikes category. Which brings us back to Sergio Canavero.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of gone a little bit off the radar in the last few years, but essentially he's a surgeon, and by all accounts, an accomplished one, a skillful surgeon, really sort of raised a lot of eyebrows by saying that he was just a few years away. I think, it's one of those things like Elon Musk. He keeps making predictions that he's going to be doing it by a certain year, and it doesn't deliver. But, clearly he was suggesting that they were very close to having a successful procedure. But if you dig a little more into what he's actually saying, his definition of success, I think, is very different to other people's.
Canavero was born in Turin, Italy in 1964, and according to him, he had a rough upbringing and a poor family, but he worked hard, and by the age of 18, he enrolled in the medical program at the University of Turin. He graduated from there and trained in the hospital as a functional neurosurgeon beginning in the 1980s. He would then go on to work as a neurosurgeon at the hospital for nearly 22 years. And really, by all accounts, he was an accomplished neurosurgeon. He did pioneering work on central pain syndrome and Parkinson's disease. He even became the director of the Turin Advanced Neuromodulation Group. And yet, in 2015, he was unceremoniously fired from his position at the university, and they cut all ties with him. For some reason.
A head transplant.
Head transplant.
Head transplant.
Head transplant.
Head transplant.
Yeah, it was a severed head thing. I also feel like I should point out that his Wikipedia page describes him as having an idiosyncratic personality. Really? The head transplant guy is a little off? Who knew? I knew. Turns out he's been interested in this topic since the 80s, but he started making real plans in the 2010s. And in 2015, he published a rough description of how he'd do it. And who he'd do it to. That man was Valery Spiridonov, who I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So Valery's story seems to have played out like this. He was 33 years old when he signed up for this, that was in 2015, and his body was still deteriorating from a condition called Wernicke-Hoffmann disease. He went from being a healthy, normal dude to having trouble walking, having trouble writing, and he just kept getting worse and worse until he was confined to a wheelchair and had to have almost everything done for him. Now, I can only imagine what that would be like in the mental state that would put you in, and I don't want to say that he was ready to, end it all or anything like that, but, with his body getting progressively worse, he may have feared what was coming with his condition more than what he feared might happen in the surgery. Now, when Cannavaro first announced the surgery, he described it as imminent, but, after his announcement, he lost his position at the University of Turin. He had to find a new home base to do this from, and he found one in China. Harbin University, specifically, where an orthopedic surgeon named Xiaoping Ren had been doing similar research. This relocating and further research kind of pushed back the imminence of the surgery by a few years, and while Valery was waiting, something kind of amazing happened. First of all, his body kind of stabilized. His disease stopped progressing. Now, that might be an overly optimistic way of saying that it got as bad as it was going to get, like it couldn't possibly get any worse, but it wasn't getting any worse. And he kind of learned to live with it. Second of all, dude got married. Yeah, he met a woman named Anastasia Panfilova, and they fell in love and got married. This is a picture of Anastasia. She married him. Oh, and she's also got a master's in chemical engineering, so she's also super smart and accomplished, and yes, they are married. Yeah, he dropped out of the surgery. So my choices are I could spend the rest of my life with a hot Russian chemical engineer, or I could have my head cut off by Dr. Nosferatu over here. Yeah, I don't know.
Cake or death?
No, all kidding aside, they are happily married, they have a kid together, they now live in Florida, and he runs his own software company. He is living his best life, and yeah, in 2019 he dropped out of the surgery. Though he does still support the mission. So the head transplant dream is dead, right? No. Does this look like a guy who gives up on things? Ren and Cannavaro's research continued throughout the 2010s, and they produced some amazing results. Kinda. For one thing, they claim to have successfully done a head transplant on a rat. It was kind of more like the dog experiments, though, where they just kind of sewed one rat's head onto another rat's body, and it only lived for 36 hours. But Cannavaro claimed it as a success because he said that the goal was to minimize the amount of blood loss. Yeah, I'm finding that success is a very malleable term when talking about head transplants. Even more impressive, in 2017, they actually did perform a human head transplant on cadavers. And it was successful. Obviously, neither of the participants survived the surgery because they were dead before it started, but by successful, they mean they were able to fully perform the head transplant protocol that Cannavaro had outlined in his 2015 paper. That protocol, by the way, is called the Heaven Protocol. Probably not the best thing to name something that's likely gonna kill you. But it stands for Head Anastomosis Venture. The sciencey term for a head transplant is cephalosomatic anastomosis. So you know that now. And this protocol that they successfully performed on cadavers and will imminently perform on living people works like this. The donor and the recipient are brought into the operating room together, and both are intubated, tracheotomized, ventilated, and stabilized, and wired for monitoring of vital signs, ECG, EEG, oxygen saturation, body temperature, and whatnot. By the way, in the paper, the donor refers to the body and the recipient is the head, so technically this is a body transplant and not a head transplant. Once both are anesthetized, the recipient's head is subjected to profound hypothermia through cooling helmets, as well as a heat exchanger applied to the femoral carotid artery. The goal is to cool the brain to around 10 degrees Celsius. The donor's body is also cooled, but only the spinal column, by pumping cold solutions into the subdural and epidural spaces. Hypothermia, of course, slows down the metabolic process and reduces damage to cells and tissues. Next is the whole removing the head part. Two surgical teams work on the body simultaneously, meticulously severing the nerves, arteries, and muscles and labeling them for reconnection later. They start with the anterior, or front of the neck, including the trachea and the esophagus, and then move the bodies into a prone position to do the back of the neck, or the posterior. This is where the spinal column is transected, exposing the spinal cord. So the cutting and reattaching the spinal cord has its own protocol that they call Gemini. I couldn't find what that stands for, but it involves an as-of-yet uninvented ultra-sharp microsurgical instrument called a geminotome. This is sci-fi technology number 1. Once the spinal cord is cut, the head is placed on the donor body as quickly as possible and the spinal cord is glued together using sci-fi technology number 2, a polyethylene glycol glue infused with chitosan nanofibers. This would supposedly have the ability to immediately reconstitute cell membranes that were damaged during the severing process. The head is then connected to the donor body's circulation, the spinal column is stabilized with a screw and rod system, and the trachea and esophagus are stitched back together, and finally, the muscles and nerves are painstakingly reconnected before the neck is sewn up. Obviously, there's a ton that I left out of that description. This is supposed to take like 36 hours and require a staff of 130 doctors. It's a massive undertaking. But when it comes down to it, like 90% of this surgery is stuff that we can totally do. You know, we can reconnect nerves and muscles, we can stitch together tracheas, we can even transect vertebrae. The thing we've never quite pulled off is the whole spinal cord thing. Hence the couple of science fiction technologies that don't exist yet. Or do they? In the interview with Valeri that I shared earlier from Good Morning Britain, they showed this footage of a monkey that, according to Canavero and his team, had its spinal cord severed, and they were able to fully repair it, giving it the ability to walk again. Now, I tried to verify this clip, because if they were actually able to do this, that would be huge. Like, huge, if true. Sorry, Cleo. But I couldn't find anything. Now, if you guys know of something that I missed, please do share it down in the comments, but as far as I can tell, this was a video that was released by Canavero and his team, and we're kind of just supposed to take them at their word. Which I find super suspicious, because these guys publish a lot of papers. Like, pretty much any time they manage any kind of advancement, they publish it and they plaster it all over the place, but I couldn't find anything on this. Now, again, if I missed it, correct me down below. Yeah, most of the Canavero monkey headlines that I could find revolved around a transplant that they did on a monkey in 2016 that survived for 20 hours, but it never had control of its body. Successful. So, okay, if I'm going to be fair to Canavero and all the other head cases, there's really two problems to overcome here. The first is just making sure that the head can be sustained by reconnecting it to a different body's blood supply. The second is giving that head control over the body by reconnecting the spinal cord. And they focused on the first problem first, which makes sense. Of course, that's, I don't know, kind of a solved problem. I mean, Demikov was doing this on dogs back in the 50s. The second problem, reconnecting the spinal cord, that's where the sci-fi technologies come in. And while I couldn't find proof of that walking monkey experiment, I did find papers that they did on experiments where they claimed to have done this with rats. Canavero's solution to this, the stitching together of the spinal cord, traditionally has been to reconnect it using polyethylene glycol, which Rohin explains the problem with this.
Polyethylene glycol actually is mostly used as a laxative. That's its most common use.
I had a colonoscopy. I'm very familiar with that, yeah.
Right, yeah. So it's not like some super high-tech liquid, right? It's basically just gloopy glue. And that is Canavero's technique, is just to now what he's basing that on is there is some experimental research suggesting that it may encourage neuronal development, so it may have a role in nerve repair. Absolutely, but to just say, you know, you're going to whack it on and stick the spinal cord, which is, you know, orders of magnitude more complex than a nerve in the hand. It's this magical thinking.
Yeah. Now, there has been a twist in recent years, and I found out about this after talking to Rowan, or I would have brought it up there, but there's a new type of PEG that they used on those rat experiments that I talked about that might actually hold some promise. It was invented by a guy named William Sikkema. He's a Rice PhD candidate in biomedical nanotechnology. He created a polyethylene glycol substrate containing carbon nanofiber ribbons that he called Texas PEG, because Rice University is in Houston. In a talk for Ideacity, William showed how these rats had their spinal cords severed and how the ones that were treated with the graphene nanoribbons made almost a full recovery. And according to William, the way this works is that the nanoribbons provide a kind of a lattice work that the damaged neurons can use to cross the divide and reconnect and heal together. Apparently when nerves get severed, they reach out in thin spikes that make it hard for them to connect. Plus, the graphene is electrically conductive, so that allows signals to bridge the gap while it's healing. So look, head transplant stuff aside, if this Texas PEG stuff could really repair spinal cord injuries, this would be a massive game changer and something to get really excited about. Luckily, William's been continuing his research at Rice University, and he's under the mentorship of James Tour, who has been accused of publishing fraudulent papers and hyping breakthroughs that don't exist and vocally doesn't believe in evolution. Have you ever researched a topic and been convinced you're taking crazy pills? Every time I think I've stumbled on something legit, it just nopes itself back into crazy town. It almost goes without saying, but this entire thing has been overwhelmingly criticized by the medical and scientific community. Bioethicist Paul Root-Wolpe from Emory University said that it, quote, walks a fine line between medical care and murder should the attempt fail. Jan Schnupp, professor of neuroscience at City University of Hong Kong, said, quote, I would really like the general public to be reassured that neither I nor any of my colleagues think that beheading people for extremely long-shot experiments is acceptable. It is not. The president of the American Association for Neurological Surgeons said in 2015, quote, I would not wish this on anyone. I would not allow anyone to do it to me, as there are a lot of things worse than death. And bioethicist Arthur Kaplan of New York University said, quote, they haven't done enough animal studies to persuade anyone that they actually know what they're doing. It's sort of a long, endless publicity tour. And I could go on, but that last one is really something I've seen a lot, repeated a lot in this whole thing, that it's not science, it's a big publicity campaign, because ultimately he's trying to raise millions of dollars to perform this surgery. He apparently even reached out to Mark Zuckerberg, trying to get him to send him money. But the scientific community has roundly condemned this thing. He lost his position at Turin University, and while he was given an honorary position at Harbin University in China, apparently they gave him the boot too a couple years back. He's gone fairly quiet since then. He claims to have a long list of volunteers since Valeri dropped out, and that he's continuing his research in an undisclosed location. It's probably an underground lair. If anybody's got an underground lair in an island somewhere, it's this guy. In 2022, he published a paper claiming that he's figured out a way to do just a brain transplant. So, yeah, if you can't get something done, just claim you can do something even wilder. Seriously, crazy pills. But Rohin had a pretty good idea of how he would do this surgery, so I'll give him the last word.
I think for this to work properly, you would need to be able to support essentially like a brain in a jar. I think we would need to get to that level of sophistication, and then maybe transplant the entire brain and spinal cord. And then you get round the problem of trying to repair the spinal cord, and then you just have to attach all the peripheral nerves, which would be, again, enormous. But I wonder if, a kind of Mortal Kombat finishing move, you take the whole spinal cord out and
Finish it.
And then plonk that in.
So will head transplants ever actually be a thing? I mean, on a long enough timeline, pretty much anything's possible, but the big hurdle has to be solving the spinal cord injury thing, which if that could be solved, it would be huge for so many people around the world. Maybe the carbon nanoribbon thing could get us there, and that would be amazing, but given how sketch everything else has been in this story, I have my reservations. Sketchy, but also just hype. A lot of hype. There's a lot of hype to sort through. My take is until they can solve that problem and can reliably do this in animals, it's just way overstepping right now. It's just doing it to say you did it. Successfully. For now, though, it seems like the hype train has left the station. That was the reason why I wanted to do this video, because I hadn't heard anything about it in a long time. Maybe it kind of ran its course. Maybe Cannavero ran out of options and decided to wait on it. Maybe focus on the nanoribbon thing. Because, hey, if he was actually able to figure out a way to reconnect a spinal cord, that would be history-making enough. So, to that, I say, Godspeed. All right, one more time, big thanks to Rohin for taking the time to talk with me. He and I had never actually spoken before, so that was really cool. I enjoyed it. If this is your first time here, maybe check out this video if you've never seen one of my videos before, or if you look down on the little sidebar if you're on your website, there's plenty of videos down there with my name on them. Give it a look, and if you enjoy it, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. But that's it for today. You guys share your thoughts down below. Would you not have a head transplant? Do you think it's ever going to happen? Do you think Cannavero's the guy that's going to do it? Chime in down below. But in the meantime, go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, stay safe, and I'll see you here next time. Love you guys. Take care. So that video was a lot of fun for me. Not only was it an interesting topic, but I got to hang out with Rohan over at Midlife Crisis, and he's amazing. He's got a great channel. If you're not following him, go check him out. Now, before I jump into the next video, I want to take a second and let you guys know about this fancy new website that we've got now. So over the last, 6 to 9 months, we've been working on this new merch site, and I've never really done a big reveal. I've never done a big launch for it or anything because, and I cannot stress this enough, I am a terrible businessman. But the site is called LastSmarter.com. It's the place where you can find all the merch that you've been used to seeing on the website this whole time, all the shirts that I wear. It's also where we're going to be adding new stuff regularly. We'll be doing some exclusive merch drops at that site that are only for a limited time, like the Tritium Tour shirt that we just did recently that was a pretty big hit. We're currently talking to some designers to help kind of expand the merchandise, but we're also putting some systems in place so that you guys can recommend merch to us, and we'll make it happen. Buying merch from this site does support the channel directly. It kind of helps round out the finances a little bit so that, I can take more risks. I can be more beholden to you guys, the audience, instead of the algorithm. But it also supports the artists that contribute designs for the merch and whatnot. And we're going to have some special products that we're going to put on there where we're going to be putting all the profits into charities. So, maybe we can put some good into the world. And if we do our jobs right, you'll get some really cool stuff out of it. Because that's what life is all about, stuff. Anyway, I'll put a link down in the description. Again, it's LastSmarter.com. Please go check it out and come back and share in the comments what you think. I want to hear it. All right, on to the next calamity. In 1969, Beth Abraham Hospital in New York had a patient named Leonard. Leonard had not left the hospital in 30 years. He was one of a group of patients who had been there since before some of the nurses were even born. And they all suffered from a mysterious illness that had swept the country in the early 20th century, one that had left them in a catatonic state, frozen inside their own bodies, like human statues. Nobody knew what was going on inside there. Were they conscious, unconscious, something in between? Or, worst of all, were they wide awake, fully aware of what was going on around them, and just unable to get their bodies to talk to their brains? Nobody knew. Then one day in March of 1969, Leonard and the others were going through their daily routines, food, cleaning, medicine, when the doctor came in with an oral medicine for each of them to drink. Now, there was nothing unusual about this. They were always tweaking their medicines, and the doctors were always testing different things to try to help their condition. The nurses didn't even ask what it was so routine. After Leonard got his medicine, they wheeled him into the rec room where the other patients were sat around TVs and stereos and whatnot. And after staring blankly at the TV for about a half an hour or so, Leonard woke up and he started to talk. Where had Leonard been this whole time? What was this sleeping sickness that had put him in this state? And what was the drug that got him out of it? And the most important question, could this happen again? I have talked in multiple videos at this point about the beginning of the 20th century and how quickly things were changing and evolving. It comes up a lot, actually. In fact, I think I talked about it last week. But it really was a crazy time. I mean, just think about how many things happened in just a couple of decades. Like, people's homes got, gas lines, and then indoor plumbing, and then electricity. Radio became a thing, and then movies. Cars were invented, then airplanes. World War I brought untold devastation and killed 20 million people. Then the Spanish flu came through and killed 50 million more. Just to put that into perspective, the global population was around 1.6 billion at the time. So between World War I and the Spanish flu, nearly 5% of the world population was wiped away. So if you knew more than 20 people, you knew someone who died from one of those two things. But just as things were settling down and the world began to recover and prepare for a Great Depression and an even bigger World War II, somewhere in the middle of all that came one of the most bizarre and still unexplained global pandemics of all time. By the way, I should point out that I actually did cover this topic in an episode of my Mysteries of the Human Body series over on Nebula. I'll go way more in depth on it in this video, but yeah, it was an episode on mysterious plagues, so if you want to know more stories like this, you can go find them there. It all started in the winter of 1916 in Europe, when patients began showing up in hospitals complaining of an extreme malaise, a total lack of energy, and an overwhelming desire to sleep. Some showed other neurological symptoms as well, like tremors and palsies and hyperkinetic movements. And in some extreme cases, patients were in basically a catatonic state, just almost comatose, unable to move or react to their environment. Luckily for most people, the disease ran its course and they just kind of went on with their lives. Although there was some ongoing neurological damage, we'll talk about that later. But for an unfortunate few, this became their permanent existence. And more of these cases seem to pop up every day. The disease got the attention of a doctor from the psychiatric neurological clinic of the University of Vienna, who had examined a handful of these patients with this disease, and he was the first doctor to write a paper about it. His name was Dr. Konstantin von Economo, which unbelievably isn't the name of a Marvel villain with the power to destroy the economy. He wrote about it in a paper published in the journal Wiener Klinische Hosenschrift in 1917. That's the Vienna Clinical Weekly for you non-Germans out there. And in this paper, he gave the disease a name, encephalitis lethargica, often shortened to just EL, also known as sleeping sickness. In the paper, he broke down several different types of the disease because different patients present a little bit differently, but because he was the first to publish, his name kind of stuck. So, in fact, it's sometimes referred to as von Economo disease. He was not the last person to publish on this disease, though, not by a long shot. The French physician René Cruchet was treating patients in a military psychiatric facility, and he published descriptions of the disease very soon after von Economo. Overall, there'd be about 9,000 papers published by EL by the mid-1920s. British epidemiologist F.G. Cruikshank published a paper in 1918 that listed several other epidemics that looked a lot like EL in the past. He pointed out Germany's Krankheit in 1672-75, Raffania in Sweden in 1754-57, and the sweating sickness in England in 1485. EL made its way to North America when the first case showed up in New York City on September 4, 1918. Within a month, 3 other cases were reported. EL spread quickly in the US during the last half of 1918, and by the spring of the next year, it had been reported in 20 states. The disease peaked worldwide in 1923 when 2,000 people in the US died from it, and literally millions around the world were infected with it. It's really about as close as you can imagine to a real-life zombie outbreak. Hundreds of thousands of people lost the ability to walk, talk, function, the disease spreading further and further with nothing short of global domination in sight. And then around 1925, it just kind of stopped. New cases stopped popping up except for a few, here and there. Those that had it eventually overcame the disease, went on with their lives. The whole affair was almost completely forgotten. But a few things remained. 1, the question of what caused it. 2, the question of why it went away. And 3, a small number of people who unfortunately just didn't get over it and remained in a catatonic limbo that went on for decades. Over the decades, doctors studied these surviving patients looking for clues to the disease's origin and pathology. And while most of it does remain a mystery, some patterns did emerge. Dr. von Economo classified EL into 3 forms: amniostatic akinetic, hyperkinetic, and somnolent ophthalmoplegic. The least common of these 3 is amniostatic akinetic. In these cases, people experience rigidity for extended periods, but they are aware of what's happening, just their movements are very slow. As Dr. von Economo wrote, quote, "To look at these patients, one would suppose them to be in a state of profound secondary dementia. Emotions are scarcely noticeable in the face, but they are mentally intact." The hyperkinetic form presented with a manic phase at the beginning, with involuntary, jerky movements in their faces, hips, and shoulders, and some vocalizations. Now that's just the first phase. After that, they experience fatigue, restlessness, and weakness, which can last for several days, and during this phase, some of them experience hallucinations and nerve pain in their faces and limbs. But the most common form was a somnolent ophthalmoplegic type of EL. Its characteristics included confusion, delirium, and feelings of being in a dazed state. Other signs are cranial nerve paralysis and an overwhelming desire to sleep. Now, one interesting link that did get made was between EL and Parkinsonism, which a lot of patients developed after the epidemic faded away. By the way, Parkinsonism is kind of a catch-all term for any neurological condition that causes stiffness, tremors, and slowed movements. So yeah, a lot of these EL patients would recover, but then later develop this kind of Parkinsonism where they become mentally and physically exhausted, their limbs would become rigid, their postures bent, and their walking unsteady. All of this would happen over the course of a few months. Now this isn't the same as, say, Parkinson's disease. That presents way differently. So doctors started to call it post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, or PEP. Some of the differences between the two include PEP occurs at any age, Parkinson's occurs generally after age 50. PEP progresses rapidly and in spurts, Parkinson's kind of steadily progresses over time. And there's no sign of pill-rolling tremors in PEP, which you often see in Parkinson's. Pill-rolling tremors are these movements that make it look like you're kind of rolling a pill between your finger and your thumb. Look out, Matthew McConaughey. The majority of cases showed up during the 1920s, about 6 months to a year following the acute EL diagnosis. Now, some studies suggest that the number of patients with Parkinsonian symptoms actually tripled during this time. Since there were so many PEP cases in the 1920s and 30s, many doctors believed that EL caused Parkinsonism. Some even thought that Parkinsonism would disappear completely when the EL generation died out. That would have been nice, but that's not what happened. And many of them did die out over the years, many from complications from EL, many from the Parkinsonism, but some just kept on going, trapped in their faulty bodies year after year with no answer in sight. So jump ahead to the 1960s where our story began, where a small group of these survivors resided at the chronic care facility in Beth Abraham Hospital in New York. By the way, just a reminder of the timeline here, these patients had come down with this in the 20s. It was now the 1960s. So yeah, 4 decades had passed. Then in 1966, a new doctor came to work with these patients, a neurologist named Dr. Oliver Sacks. He had just completed a residency in neuropathology at UCLA and was interested in exploring this and other neurological edge cases that he'd read about. When he first arrived on the ward, he described it like entering a museum or a waxwork gallery. As he would later write in his book, quote, "They would be conscious and aware, yet not fully awake. They would sit motionless and speechless all day in their chairs, totally lacking energy, impetus, initiative, motive, appetite, affect, or desire. They register what went on about them without active attention and with profound indifference. They neither conveyed nor felt the feeling of life. They were as insubstantial as ghosts and passive as zombies." He said there were motionless people fixed in strange positions and everything looked frozen. And that was kind of a characteristic of these patients. Like if you raised a person's arm in the air and let go, they would just kind of hold it there until you moved it back down. People basically just acted like posable figures. They really were human statues. Then in early 1967, a new treatment became available to treat Parkinson's disease. It was called levodopa, or L-DOPA. It works by increasing the body's ability to produce the hormone dopamine, which makes it possible for your brain to effectively transmit signals down neural pathways. And that's one of the things that is one of the root causes of Parkinson's disease. Your body stops being able to produce new dopamine, and it screws up the communication signals in the brain's motor cortex. So L-DOPA is a precursor to dopamine. It's a chemical your body needs to make the dopamine. So by giving Parkinson's sufferers L-DOPA, it helps them to make more dopamine, and that slows down the progression of Parkinson's symptoms. Sacks described it as a kind of a nutrient that serves to replace missing dopamine. It's dopamine fertilizer, if you will. And since there's a documented connection between EL and Parkinsonism, he started to wonder if maybe it would help with EL patients too. It took a couple of years to get access to the L-DOPA and to get permission to actually test it on these patients, but finally in March of 1969, he was able to get his hands on it and he administered the L-DOPA to them. And it worked. The patients awakened and acted normally. These patients who had been catatonic or just straight up asleep for 40 years suddenly came to life. They were conscious, they were coherent, they were able to move and walk and play, throw balls to each other. It was like a literal miracle. Now obviously a lot of these guys were super excited to be back to their normal lives, but some actually didn't handle it very well. They would turn violent or regressed out of this transformation. They would go back into their sleepiness state. As Oliver Sacks told Fresh Air in 1985, quote, "They were coming to and they were being awakened and animated, but often in a vacuum, often to a world which no longer made any sense for them, which had no place for them, in which they no longer had relatives, friends, or anything." I mean, think about it. When these guys went into this state, Charles Lindbergh hadn't crossed the Atlantic yet. And just months after they woke up, we landed on the moon. Many of them would look in the mirror and be confused by this old person staring back at them. And of course, the music and the fashion were bizarre and confusing to them. Have I been asleep this whole time? Unfortunately, after several months of being awake and experiencing life and getting to be alive again, the L-DOPA started to wear off. Each dose produced, diminishing returns, and eventually they stopped responding to it altogether, and they all returned to their catatonic state. Now, if this whole story sounds familiar, it's because Oliver Sacks wrote a book about it called Awakenings, and that, of course, was turned into an Oscar-winning movie starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. Next year will actually mark 100 years since the end of the encephalitis lethargica epidemic, and we still really have no clear idea of what caused it. But we do have some theories. Traditionally, theories have fallen into 2 main categories, toxicological and infectious. And a third one has actually popped up in recent years, but I'll get to that in a minute. Toxicological obviously means caused by an external toxin of some kind. For example, in England for a while there, it was thought that it was maybe caused by botulism or solanine that can collect in potato sprouts. Now, Dr. von Economo actually ruled out toxic causes like food poisoning early on because none of the patients had any gastrointestinal issues. He also ruled out typhoid, polio, syphilis, and poison gas. But what he did notice was that all the patients had flu-like symptoms. And since they were still coming out of the great influenza pandemic, he thought maybe it was an encephalitis created by the flu, like an influenza encephalitis. And there were previous instances of EL associated with flu epidemics. Unfortunately, studies showed that the brains of people who died from an influenza encephalitis had significant neuropathological differences than those who died from EL. But Dr. von Economo still believed that an infectious virus caused EL. Now, there have been various studies that both prove and deny the influenza theory, so it's never been proven, but that would also explain why the disease suddenly went away about the same time as the influenza pandemic ended. But I did mention a third theory or hypothesis earlier, and that one was proposed in the early 2000s. It suggests that it was caused by a post-infectious autoimmune disorder. For specifically the hyperkinetic form, researchers proposed antibodies against NMDA receptors. Without getting too in the weeds, NMDA is a receptor for the neurotransmitter glutamine. It stands for N-methyl D-aspartate, and it helps with neuroplasticity. So the idea is that the body is creating antibodies that are then attacking NMDA receptors, which kind of short-circuits the brain. This hypothesis was put forth by Russell Dale, a pediatric neurologist working in the UK in 2003. He was actually working with some EL patients, which, by the way, plot twist, there are still some cases that pop up here and there today. But he was working with around 20 patients or so when he noticed that more than half of them had experienced a sore throat, caused by a rare form of strep just before they started suffering from EL. And yeah, tests shows that NMDA antibodies were elevated in those patients, so he hypothesized that these antibodies may have mistakenly attacked the basal ganglia neurons. The problem is that studies that were performed during the original epidemic showed abnormalities in other parts of the brain, like the cerebral cortex. Later, in 2012, another study proposed that EL could be caused by an enterovirus, maybe even the poliovirus. Enteroviruses are made of RNA and protein, and they can enter the body through the gastrointestinal tract before attacking the nervous system. They can also spread through the air and uncontaminated surfaces. Anyway, the 2012 study showed virus-like particles in the cytoplasm and nuclei of midbrain neurons in all classical EL cases studied. They also found larger virus-like particles in modern EL cases. It should be noted that none of them were influenza particles. And while it is considered a well-conducted survey, its results have not been replicated. And that basically gets us caught up to today. Again, lots of theories, not a whole lot of answers. It might be easy to dismiss encephalitis lethargica as just a weird medical mystery from 100 years ago, but I think that would be a mistake. After all, as I just pointed out, there are still cases that pop up from time to time, just not in the epidemic numbers that we saw way back then. Although, that might not be the case anymore. Yeah, perhaps you've noticed that we've had a bit of a global pandemic ourselves in the last few years, and yeah, we're finding an alarming trend of post-pandemic symptoms that are eerily similar to the EL epidemic. According to the CDC, 6% of the US adult population is experiencing long COVID symptoms. That's actually down from previous years, which is a good thing, but that's still nearly 20 million people. Long COVID symptoms can range from lingering loss of smell and taste to extreme fatigue and mental fog. And according to a recent study, 26.4% of COVID long haulers report significant complications in their ability to perform daily activities. Now, I should say right up front, long COVID is not the same as EL. There's no unresponsive human statues this time around, and the symptoms are a lot more nebulous. In fact, The Lancet published a paper in 2021 that found over 200 symptoms across 10 organ systems in people who experience long COVID. Some research suggests that microclots that form around inflammatory molecules might obstruct oxygen flow into cells, and that would be why some long COVID patients feel tired, have brain fog, or can't breathe well. Another theory is that COVID-19 might disrupt a mitochondrial function, which makes someone feel tired or have brain fog. But there are parallels to draw here, not just because it was spurred on by a pandemic, but because some of these nebulous symptoms I'm talking about are neurological. And it's important for us to get to the bottom of how viral infections can affect the nervous system, even years after the epidemic peaks. Or as Dr. Hadi Manji of the UK National Hospital for Neurology said, quote, "Let me emphasize that many of these pandemic-triggering pathogens, whether directly or indirectly, exact a toll on the human nervous system. These effects often evade timely diagnosis, but have potential to inflict significant disability and prolonged suffering." It's going to take a really long time to really understand the ripples that the COVID pandemic put into the world. It's kind of impossible to see it from where we're standing right now at this place in history. In fact, if the sleeping sickness teaches us anything, it's that some of the downstream effects never fully get figured out. Out of the tens of millions of people infected by the Spanish flu, a small percentage developed EL. And of those, a tiny percentage never fully recovered. It's possible that the same could be true with long COVID, and that 40 years from now, a small number of long COVID sufferers are still bedridden, hoping for a miraculous cure. My God, I hope not. For anybody out there who's dealing with long COVID symptoms, my heart goes out to you. I wish you the best, and know that long COVID is not EL. Don't let this video freak you out too much. Totally different things. You know, researching this video has also made me wonder if there's some kind of connection with chronic fatigue syndrome. Something else that's been around that includes extreme tiredness in people for long periods. I couldn't find anything about it, but I still wonder if there's something there. All right, thanks so much for watching. If this is your first time here, maybe check out this video because Google thinks that it's up your alley, or you can look over on the sidebar if you're on your browser. Any of those videos that have my thumbnail on it or my name on the thumbnail, whatever, give them a look. And if you enjoy them, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. Always a big shout out to the Answer Files on Patreon and the channel members. If you are interested in supporting this channel and joining an awesome community, you can go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe or click the little join button down below to become a member. And I'm going to leave you with that. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Okay, so I just rub it on the spot, and that's it? Oh, am I supposed to do it every 2 days or twice a day? Oh, whoops. Okay, so how do I know when it's done? Will the thing just fall off, or do I need to like pick at it a little bit? Because lately it's been kind of oozing a little bit of... Oh. In November of 1941, a 23-year-old woman was wheeled into an operating room. She had a history of mental disturbances and become difficult for her family to manage, so they opted to undergo a promising new procedure that was shown to cure personality disorders. Once in the operating room, the doctor strapped her to a table. The surgeon grabbed an ice pick-shaped instrument, inserted it into the patient's eye socket, and then... That woman was Rosemary Kennedy, the younger sister of President John F. Kennedy. And the surgery was not a success. Rosemary's specific diagnosis isn't entirely clear because the family did everything they could to hide her condition, but by all accounts, she was mentally challenged. And as she entered her early 20s, she became more irritable, difficult to control, sometimes physically violent. There were also rumors that she was sexually promiscuous and just in general behaving in ways that were embarrassing for one of the most powerful political families in the world. The procedure was a prefrontal lobotomy. It was a surgery that's about as terrifying as they come, but it was hailed at the time as a giant leap forward in the treatment of mental illness. This was before psychiatric drugs like we have now. In fact, it won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949. But within a decade of winning the highest acclaim in medicine, the procedure was considered barbaric and outlawed, partly because of people like Rosemary Kennedy. Because Rosemary's condition didn't improve after the lobotomy. She was permanently incapacitated, unable to walk, unable to speak, and incontinent for the rest of her life. And she was far from the only person to receive this procedure. Did I mention the lobotomy van? Yeah, there was a lobotomy van. If you're not really familiar with what a lobotomy is, it's a procedure that's about as simple as it is brutal. A patient is placed under sedation or general anesthesia, and then a doctor takes an ice pick-like thing they call an orbitoclast, inserts it into the corner of the patient's eye, and then taps it with a mallet-like thing that they call a mallet. Because why even bother trying to make it sound less brutal? And by the way, you clicked on a video about lobotomies. This is going to get a little bit gnarly. You've been warned. By driving the ice pick into the brain with the mallet, the surgery was thought to cure severe mental illness. And there were multiple types of lobotomies, which were also, by the way, called leucotomies. That's another way of putting it. The one I just described is called a transorbital lobotomy, because it goes through the orbit of the eye socket. There was also a transcranial lobotomy that went through the top or side of your head. But this obviously required drilling through the skull. And these used a syringe-like tool called a leucotome to pierce the brain, and then it did its business inside of the brain with a little wire loop, or by injecting a sclerosing agent to harden the fibers. But the goal of all of these was to disrupt the prefrontal cortex of the brain, so they're often called prefrontal lobotomies or prefrontal leucotomies. Now, I know all this sounds grotesque and insane, but there was a reason why they were so popular for a while. It's because the alternative was even worse. There's a stigma around mental illness. Always has been, and it's still there today. But it used to be much, much worse. Because we didn't really understand how the brain worked. I mean, we barely even knew how the body worked, but especially the brain. People thought your emotions and your personality came from your soul. So if you were messed up in that department, it was a soul thing. It was a spiritual thing. A religious thing. So most people back then thought that mental illness was some kind of divine punishment or demonic possession, which came with just some really swell treatments. The first treatment is actually one of the very first surgeries that we have evidence for, and that was trepanation. Trepanation is quite simply drilling a hole into someone's head to, let the demons out. It's thought that they might have done this for mental health reasons, again, attributing to a demonic possession or something like that, or they may have just used it for headaches. But yeah, we found skulls with holes in them going back 7,000 years, and in a lot of these skulls, the hole had healed over, so they did survive this procedure. In the late Middle Ages, bloodletting and purging were often used to treat mental illness, which should come as no surprise because they treated pretty much everything like that. Yeah, they were all about the four humors at that time, so they blamed everything on an imbalance in the humors being blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. This went all the way back to like ancient Greek times, but it was an English physician named Thomas Willis that made the connection between the humors and mental illness. Which, while it sounds silly now, it was kind of groundbreaking at the time. I mean, to blame someone's emotions and behavior on a physical issue and not like demon possession was incredibly enlightened. So all of that draining of blood and forcing people to puke and torture, that's much more humane. Hey, that's foreshadowing. In the 17th century, we start to see a proliferation of asylums for the mentally ill in an effort to kind of take them out of society or sweep them under the rug. But it was also kind of justified as a place that would be best for them because at the time, isolation was a popular method of treatment. Another popular treatment was called the bath of surprise, which was common practice in many of these asylums. It kind of became a thing in the 1700s, but it basically involves sedating a patient by dunking them in ice cold water with no warning. Again, this was before any of the drugs that we have today that would calm a patient down, but yeah, it turns out that a little Dunkarino in the old ice bath can kind of shock a person into calming down. Which I'm sure there's many people out there in the ice bath cult that are like, yes, that's what it does. It releases dopamine and it calms you down and it shocks your central nervous system. I would just like to point out that you are voluntarily submitting yourself to torture that they used to do to lunatics. Just saying. The bath of surprise, by the way, eventually developed into what's called hydrotherapy, which is where the patient is kind of strapped to a tub for hours or even days on end with continuous cold water piped into it. As the 19th century and the Victorian age came around, institutionalized care was intensified, with asylums and mental hospitals springing up all across the United States and Europe. And at this point, basically just confinement became the prime directive. These asylums were overcrowded and many of the patients were physically violent, so they were mostly just concerned with protecting the staff. This is where straitjackets came in. People were often chained to walls and put in cages. And I don't mean jail cells. I mean like tiny, cramped cages the size of a dog crate for hours, even days at a time. They were subjected to wacky treatments like the rotating chair, which just spun the patients around until they threw up, which again goes back to that purging thing that was based on the four humors, so that was like way behind the times. They would sedate them with drugs, which was arguably ahead of its time, but these were very rudimentary drugs and basically just incapacitated them. And the worst part of it all was that many of the people who found themselves in these asylums were committed for fairly mundane things like epilepsy and melancholy. Willfulness was considered committable, whatever that was. Women were especially targeted. So yeah, if you didn't obey your husband or didn't abide by the crushing Victorian social norms at the time, you could be labeled hysterical and sent off to the asylum. It's safe to say that neurodiversity was not celebrated back then. Not to mention that many of the people who went in there might have just been a little bit different when they first went in, but after 6 months or a year in that environment, they actually did develop mental illness, which only extended their stay and led to more overcrowding. So yeah, none of this was working, and it's a shame because it was all instituted with the best of intentions. These asylums were meant to provide exactly that, asylum. It was supposed to be a respite from the world that was causing them all this mental instability, but it usually just made things worse. At the same time this was happening, though, brain science was progressing, and our understanding of the brain was increasing, due in part to some lucky accidents, like one that happened in Vermont in 1848. On September 13, 1848, a railroad worker named Phineas Gage was tapping down some explosive powder when the powder ignited, and blew the tamping rod through the bottom of his cheek and out the top of his head. And somehow, he survived. The Phineas Gage story has been told a million times. I've actually covered it on this channel before. It's remarkable and gruesome and just wild that this guy survived a meter-long iron rod growing through his head. But he did. He did not survive completely unscathed, though. Gage's personality changed drastically. Before the accident, he was amiable, well-balanced employee, got along with everybody, but afterwards he became difficult to deal with, easily irritable, he was impatient, he cursed at people a lot, which he never did before. He also developed severe epilepsy, which eventually he died from 13 years later. But it was this change in his personality that got the attention of the psychiatric community. This was the first time that damage to a specific part of the brain could be linked to personality issues, especially emotional regulation. And it started a whole field of study around, like figuring out which parts of the brain control what. There was a motor cortex, there was a language and speech processing area, a visual processing area, long-term memory, short-term memory, and they figured out that the brain kind of evolved from the back to the front. Yeah, so if you look at the brain, at the back of the brain, at the base of the brain, that's what controls sort of your more core functions of your body, your breathing, your digestion, like body temperature regulation, that kind of thing. And as you move forward, it evolves more advanced processing. So it's actually the front of your brain up here, the prefrontal cortex, that handles your personality, your judgment, your emotional regulation, higher core stuff like that. That's why Phineas was able to survive this blast. It didn't go through the back of the brain. If it had gone through the back of the brain, he would have been toast. The fact that he was lucky enough that it went up only through the prefrontal cortex, that's why he was able to survive. So over the next century, more attention had been paid to other, lucky accidents that helped refine our understanding of the brain and its structures. That, along with some animal experimentation that was being done, and actual brain surgery, which was a thing, but it was still in its infancy. All of which came to a head at the Second International Congress of Neurology in 1935, a conference that would change the landscape of psychology and neurology and ultimately leave thousands of people in vegetative states. It was held at the University College London on July 29th to August 2nd, and while epilepsy was the main theme of the conference, it was actually a handful of presentations on the frontal lobes that stole the show. There was the French neurosurgeon Clovis Vincent with a paper titled Modification of Function Observed After Surgical Intervention on the Frontal Lobes. Neurologist Richard Brickner from the New York Neurological Institute talked about a surgery called a bilateral frontal lobectomy that was performed by Johns Hopkins University to remove a brain tumor. And a Yale neurophysiologist named John Fulton presented a study called, quote, The Functions of the Frontal Lobes, a comparative study in monkeys, chimpanzees, and man. The study reported on a couple of chimpanzees that received lobectomies, and they demonstrated how they had a noticeable change in personality, specifically having fewer temper tantrums and experimental neuroses. Through all of this, an idea began to form. So, in the brain, the actual processing mostly occurs on the outside, the wrinkled surface, which that's why it's wrinkled, there's more surface area to do more processing. But inside the brain, there's these bundles of fibers they call white matter that basically move signals around to other parts of the brain. You can think of it kind of like the cables coming out the back of a rack of servers. Like each server is a different module, and the cables allow those different modules to communicate with each other. So these studies were showing that removing parts of the frontal lobe can make an animal more complacent. Of course, that's a major risky surgery. So maybe instead of removing, that frontal lobe altogether, what if all you had to do was just cut some of those cables so it can't communicate anymore? This idea resonated strongly with another attendee of the conference, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz. Mere months after attending the conference, Moniz and his assistant Pedro Lima performed the first leucotomy, which involved going in through the skull with a leucotome tool to sever the white matter fibers connecting the prefrontal cortex. Although in this first surgery, he also injected alcohol to destroy the frontal lobe completely. Because, why not? He would refine this procedure over the years, though his work was cut short in 1939 when a schizophrenic patient shot him several times in his office. He survived, but he was paralyzed for the rest of his life. He eventually died in 1955. The fact that he was gunned down by a patient only highlighted the fact, or at least the perception, that some people with mental illness were dangerous, which only justified the surgery he pioneered, even though it was permanent and resulted far more often than not in total mental incapacitation. And nobody picked up this cause and ran with it more than a U.S. doctor named Walter Freeman. Freeman was also at the Second International Congress of Neurology, and he met Moniz there. Moniz actually became a bit of a mentor for him. Seriously, that conference was like a focal point where all of this came together. Walter Freeman modified Moniz's procedure, calling his version a lobotomy, which is why we call it that today. He did his first lobotomy in 1936 on a woman named Alice Hood Hammett, a 63-year-old housewife from Topeka, Kansas. It did not go well. Hammett suffered debilitating convulsions in the weeks following the surgery, and she died 5 years later, likely from complications. Over the years, Freeman refined his procedure, always looking for an easier and faster, less messy way to do it. And he found one, the aforementioned transorbital lobotomy. Enter the ice pick. It was kind of a brilliant procedure in a way, because the layer of bone at the back of the eye socket is much thinner than at the top of the skull, which makes it a lot easier to puncture with a sharp implement. It's also a lot closer to that white matter that you have to sever, so you don't have to go through as much brain tissue. All you did was just knock it in and then wiggle it around once you got it in there, and the nerves are severed. And it left no visible scars. But its main claim to fame was that it was fast and could be performed in less than 10 minutes. Like an oil change. It's only brain surgery, why take your time with it? He performed the first one in 1946 on a 29-year-old housewife named Sally Ellen Ionesco. And for a brief amount of time, and I mean a very brief amount of time, this surgery was extremely popular. I mean, again, keep in mind the alternatives. Straitjackets, cramped cages, spinning chairs, overcrowded hospitals, injured staff members, and now there was this 10-minute surgery that left the patients totally docile, easy to manage, and maybe even happier? Clearly, this was far more humane. There was a lot more drool, though, because most of these patients were basically left in a vegetative state, which, again, if you're only talking about like the most violent, unmanageable patients who were suffering themselves from extreme mental illness, and given there were no better alternatives, I mean, there is some gray area there. The problem is that they went way, way further than that. They started giving out lobotomies like it was frickin' candy. They touted it as a permanent cure for virtually any mental condition. People were requesting lobotomies to fix their malaise. And they got one. It became so popular, and Freeman himself was so in demand that he took it on the road, just visiting hospitals and mental institutions across the United States. And he did it in a modified van that he called, and I am not making this up, the Lobotomobile. You know, like Batman with his ice pick of justice. Over 2 weeks in 1952, he performed 228 lobotomies in West Virginia for a state-sponsored lobotomy project called Operation Ice Pick. Freeman himself performed over 3,500 lobotomies, but something to keep in mind, he was just the face of the whole thing. There were hundreds of doctors performing this surgery. Between 1949 and 1952, over 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the US alone, and I cannot stress this enough. Most were left in vegetative states or incapacitated in some way. And hundreds of people just straight up died from the surgery. And again, these were not all like violent menaces to society. Many of them were just like on the spectrum or mentally challenged in some way. In fact, Dr. Freeman himself performed the lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy. After meeting her just once, he diagnosed her with agitated depression and performed the surgery on the same day. Rosemary's mother didn't even have time to approve the operation. And believe it or not, the lobotomy received the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1949. It was awarded to Igaz Moniz, and he was nominated by Walter Freeman. And yet, by 1955, only 6 years later, the lobotomy was almost completely discredited and banned in most places. So what happened? To put it simply, science happened.
Yes, science!
You know how I kept saying that given that there were no better alternatives, the lobotomy made a kind of sense? Well, suddenly there were some much better alternatives. The introduction of antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine just changed everything in the 1950s. They worked better, they were non-invasive, they weren't permanent, they were cheap, and best of all, they didn't turn people permanently into vegetables for the rest of their lives. They just immediately made lobotomies look savage and brutal, and they just fell out of favor really quickly. Also, just the more of them that got performed, the more people got to see the actual results of the procedure, which were usually horrifying. But Dr. Freeman, of course, would stand by his surgery to the bitter end. He continued advocating for lobotomies and doing them wherever he could for the next decade or so. He performed his last lobotomy in 1967 on a woman named Helen Mortensen, who, believe it or not, had already had 2 lobotomies. Both of them by Freeman. This third one would be her last, though, because she died of a brain hemorrhage after the surgery. This kind of seemed to be the last straw for the medical community, and Freeman was banned from operating after that. He died a few years later in 1972. Some of Freeman's patients are still alive today, like Howard Dully. He got a lobotomy from Freeman in 1960 when he was 12 years old. He was 12 years old. God. He told NPR in 2005, quote, "I'll never know what I lost in those 10 minutes with Dr. Freeman and his ice pick. By some miracle, it didn't turn me into a zombie, crush my spirit, or kill me. But it did affect me, deeply. Walter Freeman's operation was supposed to relieve suffering. In my case, it did just the opposite. Ever since my lobotomy, I've felt like a freak, ashamed." So yes, there were people who survived it and weren't turned into vegetables, but very few came out unscathed. Thankfully, lobotomies are a thing of the past, and mental health has come a long way, and brain surgery especially has come a long way. Now, there are still surgeries that operate on the same principle of like severing the white matter fibers to treat things like, say, extreme epileptic seizures and whatnot. But these are done on a totally like a microsurgical level with extreme precision. And they use robots and not ice picks. And they take longer than 10 minutes. Today, medications and psychotherapy are the go-to course of treatment for most mental illnesses, though there are still like brain stimulation therapies that get down inside the brain, like deep brain stimulation, electroconvulsive therapy, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, and vagus nerve stimulation. We have never been, as a society, more aware and accepting of mental illness than we are today. In fact, everybody seems to have something or be on some kind of spectrum, it seems like. And that all can be a bit much, and there are definitely trendy mental illnesses, which is a whole hornet's nest I'm not going to poke here. But bottom line, I would a million times rather have that over people getting ice picks jammed into their eyes for a mild depression. You know, the world is stressful and we've got a lot of problems, but just for a minute, let's just be thankful for that. Thank you so much for watching. If this is your first time here, maybe check out this video because Google thinks that it might be up your alley, or you can take a look on the little sidebar if you're on your browser. There might be some other videos down there with my name on them. Give them a click, and if you enjoy them, I invite you to subscribe because I come back with videos not every Monday, not anymore, but on Mondays. Big thanks to the supporters on Patreon and the channel members who are helping to keep the lights on around here. I cannot thank you guys enough. If you would like to join them, you can go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe or just click the join button down below. And I think that's it for today. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, stay away from ice picks. Don't try this at home, kids. And I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care. So that video was about a terrible brain surgery that was done that had some really horrible consequences. And literally like a month later, I did a video about another brain surgery, but this one had consequences that were a lot more weird. Hey, welcome! Thank you so much for clicking on this video. But why did you click on this video? Not even 10 seconds ago, you were mindlessly scrolling through your YouTube feed, and then you saw this title and thumbnail, and something in your brain had to know what it was about, so you clicked. But what was that something in your brain? Seriously, tell me, it might get my click rates up. But for real though, we've got a motor cortex, a visual cortex, an auditory cortex, but where do decisions come from? That question got a lot more complicated in the 1960s when a new surgery started being performed on people with extreme epilepsy. It was called a corpus callosotomy or split brain surgery. Yeah, try to guess what they do. Yeah, they split the brain in half. Of course, the brain is already pretty much split in half between the left and right hemispheres, but they're connected at the bottom by a bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum. So yeah, they just kind of cut those fibers. This made it so the two halves of the brain couldn't communicate with each other, which sounds like it would be a huge problem. But believe it or not, they went on to live normal lives. This surgery didn't change people's personalities or ability to function, but there were some kind of weird things that came out of it. You know, things like their left hand would start drawing something and they didn't know why. It's like there was something in their right hemisphere that was trying to communicate. They were kind of like two different people in there. So if that's the case, the question becomes which one of those two entities are, you know, running things. The subject of split brain experiments has come up from time to time on this channel, but I don't think I've ever really done a full video on it. So I decided to do one because this topic is one of those things that just really caused this shift in like how I see the world, how I see other people, how I see myself. And it came from a book that I'll be sourcing quite a bit in this video, and I highly suggest you read it. It's called Who's in Charge by the neuroscientist Dr. Michael Gazzagana. Taking copious notes, as you can see. He did pioneering work on split brain patients in the 60s and 70s. He's written several books about it, done TED Talks. I'll link it all below. But the reason this book speaks to me, if I may, I don't know, get a little personal for a second, I've kind of always had this theory that there's different gnomes in my head. Obviously, I don't think that actual garden gnomes are living inside my skull. That's crazy. But like most people, I imagine, I do have kind of different voices in my head that have thoughts that bubble up from time to time, some of which I don't even agree with. Like, call it a defense mechanism, call it a rationalization of bad ideas or whatever, but that was kind of my way of explaining why I sometimes had conflicting ideas or had trouble making a decision, or like the negative thoughts that kind of take over sometimes. That's the negative gnome taking the wheel. Not much unlike the world that they created in the movie Inside Out, which I just saw for the first time fairly recently. And I've got to say, like, the way that they structure that world inside of her head to explain how memories work and emotions work, I thought it was brilliant. Something else I liked about the movie was that the stakes were so small, but it still felt like a big thing. Like the climax of this movie is a little girl telling her parents that she's sad. And it carried more emotional weight than all of these movies where like the world ending is at stake, you know? Anyway, the point is that this book and the split brain experiments that he talks about in this book seem to make the argument that my little gnome's explanation for how my thoughts work isn't too far off the mark. And that free will and consciousness is just an illusion. There's a lot to unpack here. So maybe we could start by asking the obvious question, which is, why were they cutting people's brains in half again? Yeah, it's a procedure called a corpus callosotomy, and they started doing it first back in the 1940s as kind of a last resort treatment for severe epilepsy. Here's how it works. When you have a seizure, what happens is that there's a surge of electrical signal that disrupts the normal firing of neurons across the brain. Depending on where this occurs in the brain, you'll experience different symptoms. For example, an ocular seizure might give you a flash of light. But the worst, of course, are the ones that spread over the entire brain. These can lead to temporary paralysis and convulsions, vomiting, basically everything you think of when you hear the word seizure. And in people who get these multiple times a day to the point that they can't even function normally and no treatments seem to stop it, well, the best option is to just contain it. So the corpus callosotomy is done to prevent the signals from spreading to the entire brain, so it stays in whatever hemisphere it started in. Kind of like a surge protector. The first corpus callosotomy was done in 1936 by a neurosurgeon named Walter Dandy, kind of on accident. He was removing a tumor on a patient's pineal gland, and it required him to cut through the corpus callosum to get to it. He reported that this had no real effect on his patient, which there had been a debate for a long time about what the corpus callosum was actually for. Like, was it actually involved in processing, or was it just structural, just kind of there to hold the brain together? The result of this experiment seemed to suggest the latter. Regardless, in 1940, William P. Van Wagenen decided to try a corpus callosotomy on an epilepsy patient, and he saw mixed results at first, but they were promising enough to continue experimenting with it. By the way, if this is all starting to sound kind of familiar, all of this happened about the same time as the lobotomies, which I covered fairly recently. This was basically the period of neuroscience when they started paying attention to the white matter fibers and cutting connections just to see what would happen. I should be clear though, while lobotomies were being handed out like candy, split brain surgeries were much more extreme and pretty controversial at the time, actually. This was only for people with a very specific, very debilitating condition, and even then it was only a last resort. It really wasn't until the 60s when two neuroscientists named Joseph Bogan and Philip Vogel kind of perfected the procedure, and it became thought of as an effective, safe treatment. But not without a few weird side effects. Like sometimes they had trouble getting their two hands to work together. One patient talked about how he had trouble buttoning his shirt because he'd be buttoning it up with one hand, and then his other hand would go behind it and unbutton everything that he had just buttoned. And stories like this just kept coming up, like patients whose hands would just grab things for no reason or would mess with the other hand, to the point that Joseph Bogan decided probably somebody should research this. Luckily, he knew just the perfect person to do this, a neuropsychologist named Roger Sperry. Roger Sperry was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, and went to Oberlin College on a scholarship where he originally wanted to major in English, but he took an intro to psychology class that sparked an interest in psychology. Yeah, the story goes that apparently his professor was disabled, so Roger Sperry kind of helped him to get around and took him to various places and stuff. So he wound up kind of sitting in on conversations that this professor was having with his colleagues, talking about their research, debating different psychological theories and whatnot, and he just got sucked into it. He just found it fascinating. So he got his master's degree in psychology and later a PhD from the University of Chicago, and then he went into his career. He became more interested in neuronal specificity and brain circuitry. Basically, like how different parts of the brain work and how they're connected. He did experiments on rats and salamanders that involved kind of rewiring their nerves, like in their legs and their eyes, to see if they could adjust. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. But through all of his research, he kind of became known as an expert in how different parts of the brain work and how they talk to each other. So, of course, Bogan thought that he would be just the right guy to study split brain patients. And, of course, Sperry took him up on it because what an amazing opportunity. He did also do some experiments on animals before he went into his human research. I know none of us like to hear about animal experiments, but he did do some corpus callosotomies on some cats and tested them. Luckily, he didn't have to do the surgery on the split brain patients because, well, that had already been done. So Sperry found a group of Bogan's patients that were willing to volunteer for his tests, which focus on vision, language, and motor skills. This would involve showing words or images to the left or right visual fields to see how the different hemispheres handled it. This requires some explanation. As you may already know, the hemispheres are what they call contralateral, meaning the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, also known by its technical term crisscross applesauce. But your eyes are a little bit weirder. It's not quite as simple as just each eye goes to the opposite hemisphere. They go to both hemispheres at the same time. What happens is the two optic nerves converge at a spot known as the optic chiasm, and there they split apart, with one split carrying the left visual field and the other one carrying the right visual field. And then the left visual field from both eyes gets sent to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field from both eyes gets sent to the left hemisphere. So it's still contralateral, but with extra steps. So if you're staring at my face right now, Zoe is in your right visual field. You're seeing her blessing you with both eyes, but it's the left side of the brain that's processing that image. Your right hemisphere literally can't see Zoe right now, but it knows she's there because the left side's sharing that information through the corpus callosum. But what if you don't have a corpus callosum? This is what Roger Sperry wanted to figure out. So he came up with a series of tests along with his graduate student, Michael Gazagna, the guy who wrote this book. Sorry, I just have to clarify one more thing before I get into the results of that test. A lot of the basic functioning of the body takes place in what's called the subcortical region. This is an area that's actually shared by both hemispheres of the brain. This includes structures like the thalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and a lot of other things that you probably never heard of. But these kind of handle the basic stuff like motor control, sensory processing, something they call proprioceptive sense, which is basically our sense of our body's position in space. So that's handled before everything gets split up. There's no one hemisphere that controls that. This also includes what Dr. Gazagna calls an integrated spatial attention system, which is basically something that directs where the brain pays attention to things. So it's not like you could be doing homework with one side of your brain and gaming with the other side of the brain. That'd be nice though. Anyway, I know that was a lot of exposition, but it's just all stuff you kind of need to know before we get into the good stuff. So here comes the good stuff. So one of the first patients that they studied was a man named WJ. They kept their names anonymous for obvious reasons. WJ's test started out pretty simple. They showed him pictures and words in a right visual field, and then he was able to respond with his left hemisphere. A dog, a car, a spoon, easy. Easy because the language center is on the left side of your brain. But when they showed an image in his left visual field that went to his right side of the brain, he claimed that there was nothing there. Now, this was a really big moment because up to this point, there was still a bit of a debate around how much the corpus callosum controlled the flow of information between the two hemispheres. And this seemed to be indisputable proof because it wasn't that the right hemisphere couldn't see the object. It could see it just fine. It's that the language center of the brain is in the left hemisphere. So it literally didn't have the words to describe it. So based off of this, they tried a new experiment, this time with a basic flashing light. So what they did was they put his hands under a barrier so his eyes couldn't see his hands. And he gave each hand a button. And he told him whenever he saw a flash of light to click the button and then confirm it verbally by saying light. So they signaled his left hemisphere, he clicked the button, he said light. Then they signaled his right hemisphere. He clicked the button and then said, hey, why did I click that button? He didn't see the light, but the right hemisphere did. And it was able to communicate that it did, it just couldn't do it with language. It's kind of like the left hemisphere has a voice and the right doesn't. But now they were figuring out how to talk to the right hemisphere. And now things get a lot more interesting. These kind of results bore themselves out over and over and over again with other split brain patients as well. Like in one experiment, the left hand was placed in a box with a handful of objects in it. And then they flashed an image of the object in the right hemisphere, and the left hand was able to feel around and pick out the right object. When they asked the patient why he grabbed that object, of course, he had no idea. And sometimes the patient could just draw the image. For example, they flashed an image of a bike at the right hemisphere of one patient, and then his left hand drew a bike. But think about the experience that the patient is having. He's just sitting there, he's got a pencil in his left hand, and he's waiting for them to flash an image at him. And he's waiting. And then his left hand just draws a bike. These experiments would progress and become more complex over time, and they began to understand just how different their left and right brains really are. You know how we always talk about left brain people being analytical and right brain people being more creative, that whole thing? Well, here's how the two hemispheres are actually different. Basically, the right hemisphere was better with visual and spatial skills, and the left hemisphere was good with language. Like he described an experiment where the patient was flashed a picture of a pattern of colored blocks, and then he had to recreate it. And when they flashed the right hemisphere, the left hand was able to recreate it really easily, so the right hemisphere was really good at that. But when they did that with the left brain, the right hand it really struggled with it. In fact, there's one story of a patient who was struggling to put it together with his right hand, and his left hand kept trying to help. He had to actually sit on his left hand to keep it from trying to help the right hand out to solve the problem. According to Dr. Gazagna, quote, the right hemisphere turned out to be specialized for such tasks as recognizing upright faces, focusing attention, and making perceptual distinctions. The left hemisphere was the intellectual. It specialized in language, speech, and intelligent behavior. There were also differences in logic and problem solving between the hemispheres. Like they'd show the right hemisphere a picture of water, and the guy would point to a picture of water. Then they show the picture of a pan, and the guy would point to a picture of a pan. But when they asked what they could do with those two items, the right hemisphere just couldn't quite figure that out, whereas the left hemisphere knew right away that you put the water in the pan. The right hemisphere also struggled to come up with inferences. Like in another experiment, they showed a picture of a match and then a picture of a wood pile, and they couldn't quite figure out that the next image in that series should be a burning wood pile. And in another experiment, the patient was shown the letter U and asked to turn it into a square using a choice of shapes, and the right brain couldn't do it, but the left brain had no problem. Like the right brain is very literal. Things just are what they are. He uses the example of a box of candy. So like if somebody gave you a box of candy, your right brain would just be like, yes, that is a box of candy. But your left brain will try to figure out why they gave you a box of candy. What this means is that both halves of the brain are experiencing consciousness, but very different kinds of consciousness. As Dr. Gazagana puts it, quote, "It was becoming apparent that the right hemisphere had its own rich mental life, quite different from that of the left." So right away, we can see that there's not just one consciousness going on inside our minds, there's two. But it actually gets crazier. Turns out, it's actually multiple modules inside each of the hemispheres that can display a kind of consciousness. And they have their own things to say. So you remember earlier when I was talking about, trying to imagine what it must be like for these split brain patients when their left hand just kind of randomly does something beyond their control, how weird that must be. Well, Sperry and Gazagana were wondering the same thing. So they began developing tests to see how patients explain these actions. Like the left brain normally has a gigabit internet connection with the right. They're sharing everything. But now it can only get information from seeing what the brain does externally, from the pictures that it points to and the words that it writes and whatnot. And if the left brain is more interpretive and wired to find patterns, what would it interpret from that? Turns out a lot. So in one experiment, a patient was shown a chicken claw to his left hemisphere and a snow scene to his right. He was then asked to choose a picture that related to what he was shown. So his right hand pointed to a picture of a chicken, which obviously makes sense because the guy saw a chicken foot, but then his left hand pointed to a shovel, which makes sense because his original picture was a snow scene. But he didn't consciously see the snow scene. So when they asked him why he selected that shovel, he said, quote, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." The left hemisphere, without hesitation, came up with a justification for what the right hemisphere chose. It didn't say, "I don't know," which would have been the correct answer. It didn't say, "Oh, maybe it's this, I'm just guessing." No, it confidently declared chicken poop. And this was a result that repeated itself over and over and over again. In another example, the word music was flashed to the left brain and a photo of a bell was flashed at the right brain. He was then given several images to choose from. These images were all musical instruments, by the way, including the bell. So the patient acknowledged that he'd read the word music with his speaking left brain, and then his left hand, controlled by his right brain, picked the bell image. When asked why he picked the bell over all the other musical instruments, the patient said, quote, "Well, the last time I heard any music was the bells banging outside here. There was a church across the street." Again, the left brain, having absolutely no idea that the right brain had seen a bell, confidently came up with a justification. One more example of this was an experiment where they flashed the word red to his left hemisphere and the image of a banana to his right hemisphere. He was then asked to draw a picture with his left hand out of an assortment of different colored pencils, so he picked the red pencil and he drew a banana. But when they asked him why he drew a banana, he said, quote, "It was the easiest to draw with his hand because this hand can pull down easier." Which, by the way, makes absolutely no sense, but that's what the interpreter came up with. And this was the name that they gave it, by the way. They call it the interpreter module. They also found the interpreter module hard at work explaining emotional triggers. So, for example, in one experiment, they showed the right hemisphere a scene from a fire safety video where a guy gets pushed into a fire, and the patient just reported that she only saw a white flash, but then afterwards she noticed a change in her mood. She said, quote, "I don't really know why, but I'm kind of scared. I feel jumpy. I think maybe I don't like this room, or maybe it's you. You're getting me nervous." In another experiment with a female patient, they flashed the picture of a pinup girl to her right hemisphere, and then, without knowing why, she kind of snickered a little. And when they asked her why she was laughing, she said that they had a funny machine. Like, have you ever had a random mood change? Like, suddenly you just get angry or sad, and you don't know why? There's stuff going on in there. And in case you haven't noticed, in every single one of these examples, the interpreter module was wrong. Often confidently wrong. It got limited amount of information and assumed it knew everything about it. Might as well call it the Dunning-Kruger module. And yet, this module is kind of running the brain, or at least navigating our thoughts. Its further testing revealed that the interpreter module is just one of multiple modules in the brain, all of them kind of black boxes. Like, we don't really know how they make their choices, but they make choices, and then the interpreter module justifies it. Like for example, fMRI tests showed that different areas of the brain would light up before a conscious decision was made to, say, take an action or to say something. That was a decision being made before the decision was made. This is basically how we live our lives, just walking around justifying the decisions and thoughts that pop into our heads from various random semi-conscious modules in our skull. This fact has been such a revelation for me because I don't really think of my thoughts and my actions as me doing it anymore. You know, I mean, yes, it's me. I'll get to the theory of mind around it in just a second, but it's a lot easier to look at your thoughts and beliefs objectively if you don't think of it as being part of you. Like when I have a thought that comes up, I don't know where it came from, so I can just ignore it if I don't like it. It's not tied into my sense of self. My ideas aren't my identity. And it's a lot easier to change your mind on something if you don't have it tied to your identity. Also, once I understood that our brains are just constantly justifying things, just justification machines, basically, I find myself often just kind of pausing and asking myself, like, what am I justifying right now? It's usually when I'm procrastinating on work. Like, here's a crazy thing that we do. Have you ever noticed, like, that you felt anger or annoyance at someone after you've hurt them in some way? We've all done it. We hurt people's feelings. We failed to live up to a promise, betrayed someone. It happens. That's life. But there's a psychological phenomenon that happens where, like, we know we hurt someone and we feel bad about it, but then that justification module kicks in and just sees that, you feel bad and it has something to do with that guy. Well, that guy must have done something wrong. And then you wind up feeling resentment toward the person that you hurt, which is crazy, but we all do it. We are constantly justifying bad behavior and bad habits in the service of comfort or protection or just a dopamine hit. That's normal. It makes us human. But the awareness of it can kind of change your life. But the other mind-blowing part of it gets into questions of free will. Like, what is actually controlling our decisions? There are some that make the argument that this disproves free will, that our decisions are made by patterns of neurons firing in a predetermined manner, that we're not even consciously aware of our decisions at all. These guys call themselves determinists. Taken to an extreme, one might make the argument that nobody can be held accountable for their actions at all because they weren't the ones that made the decision to take that action. Yeah, seriously, try that in a court of law. It doesn't work. And this obviously can also be used by people who justify bad behavior because, well, I'm not the one who chose to do it. Obviously, this is a bit of a philosophical slippery slope. Like, how do you have justice and accountability in the world if there's no free will? But also, how can you have free will when your decisions aren't your own? To find an answer to this, we have to go a little bit deeper into the nature of consciousness itself. It's time to talk about emergence theory. In Dr. Gazagana's book, he talks about the quantum world and how it operates on vastly different rules from the macro world. We talked about it here on this channel a million times. But these atoms and subatomic particles that just don't play at all in the Newtonian or even Einsteinian rules that we experience, they mostly exist in probability states, actually. They manage to come together and combine to make physical matter. The air you're breathing, the chair you're sitting on, the building around you, even yourself. This is emergence theory, the idea that objects in one system can combine to create something entirely different in another system. And Gazagana talks about two forms of emergence, strong and weak emergence. He explains, quote, "There are two schools of thought on emergence. In weak emergence, the two properties arise as a result of interactions at an elemental level, and the emergent property is reducible to its individual components. That is, you can figure out the steps from one level to the next, which would be the deterministic view. Whereas in strong emergence, the new property is irreducible. It's more than the sum of its parts, and because of the amplification of random events, the laws cannot be predicted by an underlying fundamental theory or form an understanding of the laws of another level of organization." An example that's always used of emergence is how millions of individual ants with very basic programming can come together and build giant ant colonies that are basically superorganisms with organization and structures that would be impossible for any one ant to conceptualize. One could draw the same conclusion about people, like forming cities or people forming the internet. But our brains work the same way. Actually, we have a few different levels of emergence. We have the atoms combining together to make the organic molecules that comprise the neurons. You have the neurons firing in patterns that create this, subconscious module that's going on in your head. And then you have the multiple modules coordinating to create our lived experience of consciousness. Actually, it's kind of funny. I've talked about octopuses in the past on here and how they have this seemingly alien form of intelligence where they essentially have 9 brains because each arm has a little mini brain controlling it with an executive brain that sort of manages all of it. It's like a hierarchical brain system that I've always thought was fascinating because it's hard for us to even conceptualize that. But it turns out, in a lot of ways, our brains work pretty much the same way. We have multiple semi-conscious modules that coordinate at times and jockey for position at times, with an executive justifier module that takes in all their signals and tries to make sense of it. And again, determinists would look at this and say that it's all pre-wiring, we have no conscious control over it, we are basically that guy from Men in Black with the Christopher Walken looking alien on his head. Drink the coffee. So yeah, our feeling of free choice and agency over our actions is a bit of an illusion. Except, hold on, that doesn't make sense, does it? If our thoughts and actions are hardwired and controlled by some wizard behind the curtain, then how do we explain neuroplasticity? How do we learn new skills? How do we get better with practice? The fact is, according to the book anyway, consciousness is a result of both bottom-up and top-down causation. We are simultaneously making decisions on a subconscious level, but also shaping those decisions at a conscious level. It is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible to change a pattern of negative thinking by being aware of it and replacing negative thoughts with positive thoughts. We do have, to various degrees, conscious control over our emotions and thoughts. In Dr. Gazagana's words, quote, "Action is made up of complementary components arising from within and from without. That is how the machine, the brain, works. Thus the idea of downward causation may be confusing our understanding. What is going on is the match between our ever-present multiple mental states and the impinging contextual forces within which it functions. Our interpreter then claims we freely made a choice." I guess to put the question of whether we have upward or downward causation in simpler terms.
Maybe both is happening at the same time.
So, do we have free will? Yes and no. A lot of our decisions, it seems, are hardwired and out of our control, but ultimately we do have conscious control over our actions. We do have agency. This isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Sadly, if you want to commit a crime and get away with it, you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. Be rich. Anyway, there's a lot more in this book that I couldn't fit into this video. It goes on into how our brains work socially, how we have mirror neurons that cause us to mimic other people subconsciously. It's a fascinating book and definitely worth a read. I'll put a link down in the description. But again, for me, there's actually something kind of freeing about the idea that there's a lot going on up there that I don't have control of. I don't have to beat myself up for my thoughts. I'm able to give myself a little grace when I mess up. It's just a much better headspace for me. Yeah, ironically, the idea that I'm not totally in control is kind of freeing. It gives me objectivity, and it makes me a lot less reactive. I truly believe that my life has been made better by having this understanding, and that's why I talk about it so much. That's why I made this video, because I genuinely think it can help you too. And even at a societal level, like if everybody had this understanding, I think we would be a lot better to ourselves, and we'd be a lot better to each other. All right, that's it for today. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. If this is your first time here, maybe check out this video. It'll be on another psychological topic, because you clicked on this video for a reason. Brain stuff. Also, if you look on the sidebar, if you're on your browser, there's probably some other thumbnails down there that have my face on them. Go check them out, and if you enjoy them, I do invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. And that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. You go out there now, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. I don't know about you, but I could use a break after that video. What kind of a break? How about an ad break? Don't click away, guys. I'm pretty good at these. Henson Shaving has been an awesome sponsor of this channel for a few years now, and it's not just that they support what we're doing here, which is cool, and I appreciate that, but also they're just a company I'm genuinely excited to promote. They're aerospace equipment manufacturers. Like all the cool space stuff that we talk about on this channel, they're a part of that. Like they've made parts for robots that are wandering around on Mars right now. And along the way, they realized that they're in a bit of a unique position, that they can use that same level of craftsmanship and engineering to make things better here on Earth by unscamming the world. I don't use the word scam lightly, but yeah, I do think the shaving industry is a giant scam. Because what they do is they sell their razors for next to nothing, and then they charge exorbitant prices for their blades. It's a model that's made them so much money that other companies have started adopting it, and yes, they call it the razor blade model. Like, have you noticed that everything's a subscription now? That's because they figured out that if you can rope people into a recurring purchase, something they have to pay for over and over and over and over again until you die, then they can just charge whatever they want and then just swim in money like Scrooge McDuck. But Henson is out to change that. They use their mega nerd skills to come up with a razor design that gives you a higher quality shave than those 5-bladed monstrosities you're used to, with just one 10-cent blade. Engineering FTW. It holds the blade at a perfect 30-degree angle and supports the blade at up to 27 microns in depth, meaning the blade is stable, it doesn't bounce around on your skin, and it doesn't chatter. Chatter is the industry term for screwing up your skin. So you know how these 5-bladed monstrosities put their flimsy little skinny blades on those little springs? And they tell you it'll move across your skin better because of those springs. Well, it actually does the opposite. It actually causes the blade to bounce, as if on a spring. If you need proof of this, just look at these thermal images. They show blood rushing to the surface of the skin more with cartridge blades than with the regular 10-cent Henson blades. Why? Because the skin is irritated. This happens a lot less with the Henson razor. It's a better product, it's made by cool people, and it actually saves you money. How? Because if you buy a shaver with the promo code ShavingWithJoe, you'll get a pack of 100 blades completely for free. These cartridge blades that you're probably using cost anywhere from $2 to $4 each. You're saving up to $400 right off the bat. That pays for itself several times over. It's a no-brainer. Now, I tried out the Henson razor when they first reached out to sponsor the channel like 3 years ago, and I've never gone back. They're awesome. And I think you'll like it too. So if you go to hensonshaving.com, find a razor you like, they have multiple styles and colors to choose from, put a pack of blades in your cart, and use the code ShavingWithJoe at checkout. You can see for yourself. Thanks to Henson for being a great supporter of this channel over the years, and now, on to the next video. The human body is capable of withstanding massive amounts of trauma. Until it's not. Recently I told the stories of people who survived unbelievable injuries and odds and somehow came out the other end unscathed. A pole through the mouth, a nail gun into the brain, a soldier that was shot so many times, I lost count. But most of us aren't so lucky. Most of us wouldn't survive those types of injuries. But there are some people that are the exact opposite. People who met their unfortunate ends in ironic and bizarre and totally mundane situations. So get ready for a whole new set of phobias. Here's 10 people who died from incredibly minor injuries. I live my life like a Boy Scout, not because I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble, because I'm afraid I'm going to die. Because I know that whatever it is I'm doing, if I die doing it, that's what I'm going to be remembered for the rest of my life. Actually, the rest of time, because I'll be dead. I could give to charity, I could change millions of people's lives through this YouTube channel, I could invent cold fusion, but if I died while I was molesting a ferret, that's all anybody would ever remember of me. Oh, remember that YouTuber Joe Scott? Oh yeah, he was that dude that was f***ing a ferret. And that is why I don't molest ferrets. There are other reasons. But this isn't a video about people who died doing stupid things. This isn't a Darwin Awards video, which might be fun. This is a video about people who died doing just totally normal things, things that you and I might have done today. Now, some of these are extreme examples, and some of these did take place before the age of modern medicine when, these injuries wouldn't be anything to us today. But again, that just kind of reinforces the idea of just how fragile we are and how much we depend on technology for our lives. And that really is the point of this video. It's not meant to scare or to sensationalize. It's just to point out the fact that this thing you got going on right now with the beating heart and the breathing, it's not something you should take for granted. Number 10, death from hamster spit. A man named Goro Ito from Japan had a pet hamster named Aiko. And one day he was playing around with Aiko and the hamster bit him. Like hamsters do. Bad hamster. And then, unexplainably at first, Goro Ito died. Very bad hamster. The autopsy revealed that there was apparently some protein in the hamster's spit that reacted badly in his body, and his body went into anaphylactic shock. And that's what killed him. Now, I've never heard of anybody being so allergic to a hamster that a bite would kill them, so it might have been something special in this particular hamster's saliva, or it might have been something special with Goro Ito, but either way, damn. Number 9, death from peacock scratch. Peacocks are known for their displays, but apparently they got a bit of a kick. On March 30th, 1997, a guy named Vikai Tongo went out to feed one of his 4 peacocks. Apparently his family had a flock of peacocks when one of them jumped up and started clawing at his head. Probably not the best day he's ever had with his peacocks, but it didn't seem like anything that unusual. But then the next day he started suffering from really strong migraine headaches and then eventually fell into a coma. The hospital did a scan and found that there was a blood clot in his brain that was apparently caused by this peacock clawing at his head. It like dislodged something and it went up into his brain and put him into a coma. And yeah, he died the next day. Something tells me his family had one less peacock after that. Number 8, death from deodorant. Jonathan Capewell was a kid from Oldham, England, and like many kids, he wanted to smell good. He liked to spray some deodorant on himself, but apparently he took it a bit too far. Apparently he would cover his entire body with deodorant twice a day, and on July 20th, 1998, he died from a heart attack. The doctors determined that the heart attack was caused by the deodorant gases that had built up in his system over time because he did this in a very unventilated room. Apparently before he died, this was like a jokey thing amongst his family, that he sprayed so much deodorant that, you know, they couldn't hardly breathe downstairs. But I'm amazed how people can have phobias about the weirdest thing. He clearly had some kind of phobia about his body odor, and that's what caused him to do that. It's a shame. Number 7, death from manners. Tycho Brahe was a famed Danish astronomer. Many of you probably know who he is if you're really into astronomy. The big, huge crater at the bottom of the moon that has the rays that are spraying out from it. You can't miss it. That's actually called Tycho Crater. It's named after him. Well, Tycho Brahe did a lot of amazing things in his life, but his death was so bizarre. What basically happened was he was at a dinner party, and it was apparently very rude to go to the bathroom, to get up to go to the bathroom or leave the table for any reason during a dinner back then, and he really needed to pee, but he refused to go for that reason. Apparently it built up so much it caused bladder complications, and after the banquet he was unable to urinate the way he needed to, and 10 days later he died. Apparently he wrote his own epitaph, and it read, "He lived like a sage and died like a fool." Actually, Tycho didn't completely live like a sage. He lived a little bit like a fool as well, because he famously wore a gold or bronze nose because his nose got cut off in a duel one time. Although it could be argued that duels were a matter of manners back then as well. That was a social custom that he stuck to, and he suffered for that as well. Man, he might have been the most polite human being that ever lived. Number 6, death by dessert. Adolf Fredrik, the King of Sweden, actually ate himself to death in 1771 after a meal consisting of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, cabbage soup, smoked herring, champagne, and 14 servings of his favorite dessert, selma, which is bread dipped in a bowl of hot milk. He's actually known today by Swedish children as the king who ate himself to death. I wonder if Tycho Brahe was at that meal, because that would have taken a while. Number 5, death by laughter. How many times have you said you died laughing at something? And you've never done it, have you? Poser. Well, Alex Mitchell of England did exactly that. On March 24th of 1975, he was watching an episode called The Kung Fu Capers of his favorite TV show called The Goodies? The Goodies. He was watching the Kung Fu Capers episode of The Goodies, where he wound up laughing for 25 minutes straight until it actually made his heart give out and he had a heart attack and he died. As tragic as that is, his widow actually sent a letter to the Goodies actually thanking them for making his final moments so wonderful. And I don't know about you, but I really want to see what this show was now. Number 4, death by fastball. Ray Chappie Chapman was a shortstop for the Cleveland Indians, and in 1920 he was taking a pitch from Carl Mays that went a little bit awry and hit him in the temple. Well, Carl Mays must have had a hell of an arm, because this actually knocked him out and he died. To this day, he's the only baseball player that has ever died from getting hit by a pitch. Number 3, death by frustration. Jack Daniels, yes, the Jack Daniels, died from an infection in his toe. An infection that began because when he woke up one day in 1911, he was trying to get something out of his safe. He couldn't remember the combination to the safe, couldn't get the safe to open, so he kicked the safe in frustration. Broke his toe, caused an infection, gangrene set in, and that did him in. And apparently his last words were, "One more drink, please." Number 2, death by tongue. Alan Pinkerton, who founded the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, was just walking down the street in Chicago in 1884, and he slipped, which caused him to bite down on his tongue. And apparently this was not like the kind of bite you get when you're, eating crackers and you slip and you bite your tongue. This was so bad it actually broke through the tongue. The tongue became infected, he got gangrene, died. This must have been before Listerine. And number 1, death by irony. Bobby Leach was one of the greatest daredevils of all time at the beginning of the last century. He was known for doing some really crazy stunts, but one of the biggest stunts he ever did, he was the second person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. I'm still not sure why people wanted to do that so badly, but that was just a huge thing once upon a time. But after a lifetime of cheating death in various crazy ways, he was apparently just walking down the street one day in New Zealand, slipped on an orange peel, and broke his leg. Once again, an infection set in from the broken leg, complications resulted from that, gangrene, died. See, and this is the kind of thing that I was talking about at the beginning. If you're a stunt man, of course, you're gonna wind up going in some totally mundane way. At least I would. That's the story of my life. So what can we learn from this? I guess one way to look at it is that the body is like a fine-tuned machine, really, when it comes down to it, and all it takes is just one little glitch to make the whole thing fall apart. I mean, if you think about it, the things that kill most people are very tiny things. Strokes, heart attacks, clogged arteries, blood clots, those kinds of things. Those kill people every single day, and they're microscopic. So maybe it's not so much the size of the injury as where you get it. So enjoy the life you have. Don't let this video freak you out too much, because the reason these are noteworthy is because they were so bizarre and strange. Most people would not die from things so simple. And by the way, like I said at the beginning, most of these took place at a time before the kind of medicine that we have now. I doubt if you kicked your safe that you would die from your toe getting infected. But just to be safe, leave the ferrets alone. And just real quick, I wanted to let you guys know I do have a podcast if you're into that kind of thing. I'd recorded a podcast recently where I talked to Doug Vakoch of Medi. I did the video about their Arecibo message recently, and Medi is the group that wants to message aliens. He reached out to me. It was really awesome. We had a great conversation talking about why it would be a good thing to talk to aliens, or try to talk to aliens, and how the real benefit in doing that really is just kind of discovering our own place in the universe. It was a really interesting conversation. So if you want to check it out, put a link right there. I'll put a link down in the description. Definitely go see what you think. Please like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, do check out some of my other videos. I talk about very random topics on random Thursdays, and Mondays I do more technological and science-oriented videos. And if you like those, please subscribe, because I come back with videos Mondays and Thursdays. All right, that's enough for now. You guys go out, you have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. One thing that's kind of mind-blowing to me is the fact that the germ theory of medicine, the idea that our illnesses are caused by microscopic bacteria and viruses and whatnot, is only about 150 years old. That's 2 George Lucases old. And our ability to counter these microscopic bugs with antibiotics is even younger. Penicillin was discovered in 1928. That's 6 years younger than Betty White. But yeah, pre the United States Civil War, medical theory was dominated by the idea of humorism, the idea that there's 4 different humors in our body, and our illnesses are caused by imbalances in those humors. The humors in question were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood, and the treatments that were designed were done to increase or decrease the levels of these humors. Sometimes that meant potions or teas, and sometimes this meant just getting it out of the body in the form of bloodletting. Bloodletting was prescribed for basically everything. Headache, cough, upset stomach, you name it. It was like the go-to thing that they did first. First things first, try a little bloodletting. If that doesn't work, try something else. And if that doesn't work, try some more bloodletting. Luckily, that never killed anybody. Okay, it never killed anybody famous. Okay, it was a bad idea. If humanity has had one consistent enemy across all of our existence, it has been disease. In fact, the war between man and disease might be the most long-running epic war of all time. Well, second longest. It's a little embarrassing to admit it, but it's a war that we've mostly been losing, despite our best efforts. Humorism might sound a little batty now, but at the time, it was cutting-edge medical technology. Before humorism, your illness might have been blamed on evil spirits or ghosts or angry gods, and you might be prescribed prayers or rituals or sacrifices. In Babylonia, for example, if you ground your teeth in your sleep, a doctor might assume that your ancestors were angry with you and would prescribe for you to go and lick the skull of a dead relative, because I guess that would make them happy. In the 1500s, they had a treatment called half a mouse. What is half a mouse? Well, it's a skin treatment where they would take a mouse, cut it in half, and then apply that half of the mouse to the boil or wart or bruise or whatever it is you're trying to get rid of. Why? Why? So not only did that never work, even once, but these mice could have been carrying fleas, and fleas were what were carrying around the bubonic plague. So not only were you not curing a disease, you were actually helping to spread it. So bad for people. Also bad for the mouse. Then, of course, there's the powder of sympathy, which was used all the way up into the 1600s. And the powder of sympathy was basically something that was used to heal wounds caused by weapons at the time. So to heal the wound, you would simply spread the powder of sympathy on the weapon. And no, I didn't misspeak. Not on the wound, on the weapon. It's the 1600s, age of gunpowder. Come on, people. But hey, if the 1600s feels like ancient history to you as recently as the Victorian times, a popular treatment was for people to eat people. Now seriously, it was popular at the time, especially in Europe, to grind up the remains of Egyptian mummies and put them in teas and potions and drink them. Now this actually became a problem. There were black markets that sprang up around archaeological digs and museums in Egypt and the Middle East where people were pilfering mummies for this purpose. These were not only important historical artifacts, but they were also, you know, like real people that lived thousands of years ago. Countless remains were just ground up and consumed. Old medicine bad, you get it. Considering all that, it's actually surprising how much they did know. At the New York Academy of Medicine, there's a papyrus scroll from ancient Egypt that gives us a good idea of what they did actually understand about the human body. Turns out they had a basic idea of how infections work, the purpose of the heart, the effects of brain injury, and the importance of sterilization. This particular scroll also details 48 separate medical cases and the treatments that were used for each one of them. As James Allen, former curator of Egyptian art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, said, "What they knew about the body is quite striking, though they did not always understand it." So despite all these crazier treatments that I was just talking about, they did manage to get some things right. I mean, after thousands of years of just trial and error and trying different things out, eventually something's gonna work. And some of those ideas are still in practice today. Number 1, don't throw that out. Now I mentioned penicillin earlier. Most people are aware that Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin through a type of mold, but he's not the first person to use mold to cure diseases. Used as far back as the 1500s BCE, Egyptians treated festering wounds with what they called infected barley bread. And then a few centuries later, the Chinese, the Greeks, and the Serbians all had created different various types of molds to treat skin infections. There are documented cases of ancient Romans and even medieval jousters using a similar technique to treat wounds. Now, although not nearly as effective or safe as using straight penicillin, this technique did make a difference. It actually cut down on the death rate of infections, and this was at a time when the smallest cut could lead to an infection that could kill you. But the major reason this is still relevant to modern day medicine is that this might actually be something we'll need to turn to avoid the, you know, antibiotic apocalypse. I covered this in a previous video, but scientists have been warning for years that overuse of antibiotics could lead to superbugs that are antibiotic resistant and create worldwide pandemics. But using fungus instead of antibiotics works a little bit differently. Researcher Paul Hamlin and his team at the British Textile Technology Group in Manchester have been exposing human fibroblast cells to various strains of fungi. Fibroblasts are the key to the healing process and lay the foundations for scar tissue to form. Hamlin's research has shown that the fungi rich in chitin, a structural polymer in the fungal cell walls, acts as sort of a chemical scaffolding, attracting and anchoring the fibroblasts and preparing for the next stage of wound healing. And a sister compound of chitin called chitosan is oxidized during this process and generates tiny trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide, which is also essential for healing. Now this type of treatment wouldn't completely do away with antibiotics by any means, but it could be an effective treatment for people that are recovering from surgeries. Hamlin and his team are currently searching for partners that can help develop this into wound dressings that have this mold in it. But since the mold is pharmacologically active, it's going to take a lot of human trials before this actually hits the market. Number 2, this one just sucks. Let's talk about leeches. Okay, remember when I mentioned bloodletting earlier? They also used leeches a lot. It was just a slightly safer way of removing a patient of all of her pesky blood. But even outside of bloodletting, leeches were used as a treatment for a variety of issues, including tonsillitis and hemorrhoids. Both of those sound horrifying. But as you may have already figured out, leeches are still used today, especially in cases of reattaching a finger or a limb. One of the biggest difficulties in reattaching things is how fragile the blood vessels are and the blood clots that come up during trauma like that. Surgery often requires doctors reconnecting blood vessels only millimeters wide, hundreds of them at a time. It's very difficult work that uses sutures the size of a human hair or smaller, and it's very iffy. The success rate is not great. Leeches secrete anticoagulants that keep the blood from clotting because obviously when you're trying to suck blood out of somebody, you don't want that blood to get all stuck up in your teeth. And this smooth flow of blood is absolutely necessary to make these reattachment surgeries work. Otherwise, without that flow of blood, it'll just decay and die. The prescription of leeches may sound medieval, and, well, it was medieval, but hey, if it works, it works. Number 3, baby flies makes them sound cuter. Initially used by Native American tribes hundreds of years before the European invasion, it wasn't until the Civil War that maggot therapy became the new hotness. Soldiers in the Civil War were dying from infections by the thousands, and they began to notice that maggots, which are usually associated with death and decay, were actually saving lives. When they hatch from an egg, maggots are programmed to eat, just do nothing but eat. That's all they do for days after they're born. But when in a wound, what they found out was that they only eat dying and decaying flesh, not the living flesh. This greatly sped up the healing process and massively cut down on infections. Confederate physician John Forney Zacharias reported, "During my service in the hospital at Danville, Virginia, I first used maggots to remove the decayed tissue in a hospital gangrene and with eminent satisfaction. In a single day, they would clean a wound much better than any agents we had at our command. I used them afterwards at various places. I'm sure I saved many lives by their use, escaped septicemia, and had rapid recoveries." Maggot therapy mostly died out after the discovery of penicillin, but it's starting to make a bit of a comeback. It was actually approved by the FDA in 2004 and has been especially useful in diabetic cases where their skin lesions require rapid recovery and monitoring. Number 4, like I need a hole in my head. Trepanation, or the act of boring or drilling a hole into the skull, might be one of the oldest surgeries in our history. In fact, there's proof of this surgery going back all the way to Neolithic times. And it doesn't stem from one area either, from Egypt to Europe to China to Mesoamerica. It seems to be all over the place and surprisingly common. Out of all the Neolithic skulls that we've collected, between 5 and 10% seem to show signs of trepanation involved, and in most of these cases, they think that these people volunteered to do this. Cool. Yeah, but why? It's thought that this was done to relieve pressure on the brain. Most of these cases, it looks like it was done with very surgical and precise tools, and in a lot of cases it looks like the wound might have actually healed over a little bit, meaning that the patients actually survived the procedure. Hippocrates wrote about trepanation as a treatment for dented or misshapen skulls, but he also promoted it for a variety of reasons, but also a lot of these look like they were completely non-medical reasons. Dude, Neolithic cosmetic surgery was metal. From the late 90s to the early 2000s, 12 skeletons from the Chalcolithic, or Copper Age, were discovered in southern Russia, and every single one was trepanned in exactly the same place. It's an area of the skull known as the obilium. It's where blood from the brain collects before flowing into its main outgoing veins. This is actually a pretty dangerous area to perform cranial surgery. And what's more is that all the skeletons were young and healthy and seemed to be not burdened by any other kind of affliction. Researcher B.M. Mednikova of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow believes that these surgeries were ritualistic and that the intention of the ritual was to possibly awaken superhuman abilities in chosen members of the tribe. Now, to be fair, in most cases, trepanation seems to have been some kind of a treatment for pain or pressure inside of the skull, or as some kind of emergency last-ditch effort. Today, trepanation is used as a treatment for epidural or subdural hematoma and is now called a craniotomy. Number 5, eating poop. Yeah, really. As long as we've had stomachs, we've had stomach aches. Now, most of the treatments for stomach ache are very short term, just to relieve the acid indigestion that's going on in the stomach. But for chronic stomach aches, there were other options. Now, in most cases, somebody with chronic digestive problems is just something they're going to have to live with. But in ancient China, somebody got an idea, a weird idea, a gross idea, but one that strangely worked. Fecal transplant, also known as fecal bacteriotherapy, is when they take feces, poop, from one person and put it into another person to introduce better gut flora into their system. Strange as that sounds, the science behind it is actually pretty solid. The human digestive tract is host to numerous bacteria that in many cases actually help with digestion and gastrointestinal health. In some cases, for one reason or another, a good portion of these bacteria can be killed off, leaving the intestines vulnerable to other, much more harmful bacteria like C. difficile colitis. A common modern cause for this happening is, again, an overuse of antibiotics. What a fecal transplant does is it changes the bacterial makeup of a person's intestines, allowing it to get back to, business. Now, originally this was done by a person drinking a liquid suspension of another person's fecal matter. Not great and not terribly safe. Nowadays, the donor sample is usually inserted using a feeding tube or through a colonoscopy. I mean, that doesn't sound like much fun either, but if it's a choice between having stomach aches for the rest of your life and, inserting a little poop, do the poop. Now, obviously, by today's standards, a lot of what they did back in the day just seems absurd, but a lot of what they did back then was just taking shots in the dark. All right, let's try this and see what happens, and his heart exploded. Okay, what's next? And even when they did get a treatment to work, it was a question of why it worked in the first place. And since their understanding of molecular science was practically non-existent, they came to some very dubious conclusions. I'm not saying it was like a never-ending episode of Medical Jackass or anything, but actually that's exactly what it was. But as silly as it all seems in hindsight, much of our current understanding of medicine benefited greatly from a lot of those trial and error efforts from back in the day. And when there's no methodology and no actual understanding of the cause of diseases, all you're left with is old wives' tales and superstitions, then it's mostly going to be error. Long story short, be glad you're alive today. Alright, thanks for watching that. I hope you found that interesting. If this is your first time on this channel, you might want to check out this video. Google thinks that it's up your alley, and there's other videos that are probably going to be on the little sideline over here. And if you do enjoy them, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and every Thursday. Thanks again for watching. You guys go out now, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. It's Halloween, and chances are many of you have been indulging in some scary movies over the last few weeks. Maybe some of you have plans to watch some scary movies tonight. Maybe you'll be in bed by 8. I don't know. I'm not here to judge. A popular subgenre of horror films is known as body horror, which plays off of our fears of losing control of our own bodies. Either to aliens like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or technology like The Fly. Or to the thing in The Thing. Or the stuff in The Stuff. Or the blob, and you get the idea. The idea that our own bodies, or the bodies of those around us, could be weaponized in some way is a deep instinctual fear. There's a reason why the trope of, patient gets wheeled into the emergency room and infects the entire staff with a mystery illness thing gets used so much. And yet, in February of 1994, this actually happened. A woman got wheeled into an ER, and the minute a needle pierced her skin, she emitted a toxic poison that made people around her just start collapsing to the floor. This is the somehow 100% true story of the toxic lady. A mystery that doctors and scientists have been struggling to explain ever since. February 19th, 1994 was just like any other day for the staff of Riverside General Hospital. A car accident or two, a drug overdose, an old guy complaining of chest pains. Nothing out of the ordinary for an LA suburb. And then at 8:15 in the evening, paramedics wheeled in a 31-year-old Hispanic woman who was breathing shallow and barely conscious. They moved her into a space marked Trauma Room 1 and began trying to stabilize her. They assessed what they knew so far. Her name was Gloria Ramirez. She was 31 years old. She was being treated for cervical cancer. And now, for whatever reason, her vital signs were crashing. Along with the shallow breathing, her blood pressure was dropping fast. Her heart was beating too fast for the chambers to fill with blood. So they gave her lidocaine and beryllium to control her rapid heartbeat, as well as Ativan, Valium, and Versed to help sedate her. At this point, hospital staff were pouring into the room to try to get her situation under control, including RN Susan Kane, resident Julie Gorczynski, and the head of emergency Umberto Ochoa. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch used an ambibag on her to help her breathe. But nothing they did seemed to work. Ramirez's vital signs continued to plummet to the point they had to use a defibrillator to restart her heart. When they cut off her shirt to apply the paddles, they noticed a kind of oily sheen covering her body that seemed to give off a fruity, garlicky smell. The RN, Susan Kane, took a blood sample for analysis, and she noticed that the blood kind of smelled strange. This is actually not that uncommon for chemotherapy patients, but the chemo scent is usually a bit more putrid. This had more of an ammonia smell to it. Even weirder, after she drew the blood, she noticed in the vial there were like small manila-colored particles floating around in the blood sample. And this is where things get really weird, because she barely had a chance to even say anything about it before she literally fell to the floor, saying her face felt like it was burning. Unable to even stand, the staff had to put her on a gurney and whisk her out of the room, but as she was being whisked out, Gorczynski started to feel lightheaded. She left the room to go to the nurse's station and kind of get her head together when one of the nurses asked if she was okay, and she just fell to the floor and began to shake uncontrollably, barely able to breathe. At about the same time, Maureen Welch fell to the floor back in the trauma room, and her arms and legs were like stiff and uncontrollable. This was officially the breaking point, and the head of emergency, Umberto Ochoa, ordered the ER evacuated. Nurses and doctors immediately scrambled to wheel their patients outside into the parking lot, where they kind of set up a makeshift temporary outdoor trauma center. Ochoa and a few others stayed behind to try to save Ramirez's life, but they were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at 8:50, just 35 minutes after she was wheeled in. But now, they had to figure out what the hell just happened. So to be safe, they moved her body to an isolation room, and along the way, one of the two orderlies began to vomit and complain that her skin was burning. By the end of the night, 23 of the 37 people on staff were experiencing some kind of symptom, 5 of which were actually hospitalized. Julie Gorczynski got it the worst. She would eventually spend 2 weeks in intensive care, suffering from hepatitis, pancreatitis, and something called avascular necrosis, which is a condition where the bone starts to get deprived of blood and dies off. What the hell happened to Gloria Ramirez that caused her to secrete this mystery toxic substance that affected 24 people? Was it the chemo medicine? Was she poisoned? Was she like an act of terrorism where somebody used her as a kind of human chemical weapon? There is no shortage of theories around this event, and for good reason. It's one of the craziest medical mysteries ever documented. One that would have Gloria Ramirez go down in history, unfortunately, as the toxic lady. Here's what we know about what happened, and the best theory that's been put forth so far. All right, so back on the night of February 19th, as the ER staff was treating their patients in the parking lot, some of those patients being the staff themselves, a team of investigators arrived in hazmat suits to search the ER. They were looking for any kind of volatile toxicant that could still be in the emergency room's air, one of which that they were looking for was hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a poison that can kill somebody with 1 or 2 whiffs if it's at high enough concentrations. It also tends to smell like rotten eggs. That's the sulfide bit. And that was also a bit of a problem because nobody really reported smelling rotten eggs when the incident occurred. It doesn't matter because the investigators didn't find anything. They also looked for phosgene. This is a gas that's been used in the preparation of several organic chemicals, but it's also been used in chemical warfare. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. What it actually does is it tears open the capillaries in the lungs and the victims basically just drown in their own blood. So that's fun. Luckily for everybody on staff that night, that's not what they experienced, and it also wasn't found in the air by the investigators. That or anything else that they could use to explain it. So then they examined the body, still in their moon suits to be safe. They took blood and tissue samples and then sealed her body in an airtight aluminum crate, again, just to be safe. These samples were then sent to the Riverside coroner. He wasn't able to find anything that really stood out to him, so he sent it on for more advanced testing. Using a computer-guided combined gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, they found codeine, lidocaine, Tylenol, and T-Gon, an anti-nausea medication. None of which is unexpected for somebody going through chemo. There were, though, a few things that were unexpected. One of which was amine, which is a derivative of ammonia. This may have contributed to that ammonia-like smell that Susan Cain noticed. The second standout result was nicotinamide. Nicotinamide is a B vitamin that's crucial to our health. You can actually find it in a lot of multivitamins. I've taken it myself at times. So that might mean nothing, but it can also be mixed into drugs like methamphetamines, which could mean a whole different thing. And last but not least is dimethylsulfone, and this one was interesting because it's usually used as an industrial solvent. But it can be produced naturally in our bodies from amino acids that contain sulfur. It usually breaks down in the liver in 3 days, so it's rarely detectable, but there was a lot of it in Gloria's blood. So this was weird, but regardless, it wasn't enough to kill her, much less poison the rest of the ER. So, yeah. With still no answers, the California Department of Health and Human Services stepped in to investigate. They assigned doctors Anna Maria Osario and Kristen Waller to the case, and they interviewed 34 people who were on staff that night, compiled all the data, and eventually concluded that, wait for it, it was an outbreak of mass sociogenic illness. Mass hysteria, like the dancing plague. Their theory was that whatever it was in the blood that had that smell triggered a panic attack that just sort of traveled around the room. They cited the lack of any evidence for a poison and also the fact that women on staff suffered the most severe symptoms, which sounds kind of sexist, but the authors of the report were both women, so yeah, do with that what you will. They also cited the fact that the people who responded the worst to this had skipped dinner that evening, not to mention the fact that Gloria had been in an ambulance with paramedics who also suffered no symptoms, even after being in close contact with her blood in a small enclosed space. That is weird, but still, so much of this theory just doesn't make sense. First of all, this wasn't a bunch of shrinking violets. These were experienced ER doctors and nurses. They saw car crash victims and gunshots on a daily basis. There's no way that a bad smell was going to make them all faint. And by the way, it wasn't just fainting. They had real diagnosed physiological problems from this. Julie Gorczynski, she lost so much bone density she had to be on crutches for 6 months. 6 months that she wasn't able to work. And because of this report, now she couldn't collect any workers' comp insurance. So, yeah. She filed a lawsuit. I think understandably so. So this is when Gorczynski and her lawyer reached out to Brian Anderson at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He's actually the guy who ran the gas chromatograph tests back in March. They felt like there must be something to those anomalies that were found that I talked about a minute ago. He was still pretty stumped by this whole thing, so he enlisted the help of the lab's deputy director, a guy named Pat Grant. Let me just stop for a second and acknowledge that I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you here, and you're probably starting to feel like you're getting in the weeds, and we are getting in the weeds a little bit, and we're going to get a little bit more in the weeds because some of this is about to get really technical, but hang with me. This is really wild. Okay, so we got this new guy, Pat Grant, right? So he's looking at this file while he's flying to a business meeting in Washington, D.C., new pair of eyes and all that, and he notices something that was missed before. So he speculated that the lab's detection of dimethylsulfone might have actually been a slightly different chemical, dimethyl sulfoxide, also known as DMSO. Okay, what the hell is DMSO? DMSO is a heavy-duty degreaser. It's often sold in gel form in hardware stores, but it has a really interesting history. So it turns out that Grant used to work in a kinesthetics lab with athletes back in the day, and it was actually a bit of a folk remedy for like achy muscles and joints that the athletes used to use. Like, it actually used to be sold for that purpose, but then it was kind of banned in the 1970s after some lab tests showed that it could alter the lens of the eye. But still, a lot of people swore by it, and let's face it, when you're in pain, you'll pretty much do anything to make it go away. So it actually wasn't uncommon for people to just go to the hardware store and get the industrial form of it and use that to treat everything from, arthritis, muscle strains, and yes, cancer pain. This might be the explanation for that oily sheen that they saw all over her body in the ER, also the garlicky smell. And DMSO can combine with oxygen to create dimethylsulfone, which would explain why it was so high in her blood. Plus, the paramedics had put her on oxygen on the way to the hospital in the ambulance, so her blood was flush with oxygen. Ah, see? Okay, so the pieces are coming together now. It's all making sense. Ha-ha! Except this still doesn't actually explain the incident at all. None of those chemicals are toxic in any way. But this did get Grant thinking, like, if you could combine oxygen with DMSO to create dimethylsulfone, what other chemicals might be created with that? I mean, especially considering how high her oxygen levels were. So he hit up the Merck Index, basically a Bible of more than 10,000 biological, chemical, and drug substances. And yeah, it turns out if you add 2 more oxygen atoms to dimethylsulfone, which is written out as CH3-2SO2, you get dimethyl sulfate, CH3-2SO4. And yes, we have gone from dimethyl sulfoxide to dimethyl sulfone to dimethyl sulfate. Thanks, science. Okay, so there's a chance that she was able to make dimethyl sulfate. What is that? Well, it turns out it's a nerve gas. And it's not just a little poisonous either. Tests have shown that a 10-minute exposure to half a gram dispersed over a cubic meter of air can be fatal. In fact, it was tested as a nerve agent for war, but it was never actually used. It basically kills cells in exposed tissues like the eyes, lungs, and mouth, and its symptoms include convulsions, delirium, paralysis, and coma. All of which is lining up perfectly with the symptoms from the hospital staff. All right, so here's where things stand. Gloria Ramirez was suffering from cancer and used DSMO as a folk remedy to help with the pain. She collapsed, possibly from cancer-related kidney failure, and the paramedics put an oxygen mask on her in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Her blood became oversaturated with oxygen, which mixed with the DMSO to form dimethylsulfone, which mixed with more oxygen to create dimethyl sulfate that was dissolved in her blood. So the guys at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory tested this theory using a substance called Ringer solution. It's kind of a stand-in for blood. Not only were they able to get it to work at normal body temperature, when the solution cooled to room temperature, the dimethylsulfone began to crystallize. Those crystals explain the white particulates that they found in the sample of her blood. So all of this is fitting and working and coming into place, but at least still one mystery, which is how did this dissolved dimethyl sulfate become gaseous? Dimethyl sulfate has a pretty high vapor point, around 148 degrees Celsius, which is maybe one of the reasons why it was never used in combat. But that is 148 degrees Celsius at 1 atmosphere of pressure. The lower the pressure, the lower the vapor point. For example, if you put water in a vacuum chamber and started lowering the pressure, it would eventually start to boil at room temperature. Which is why if you're ever exposed to the vacuum of space, the last thing you would experience would be the water on your eyeballs boiling off. Sleep tight, kids. Okay, so with that in mind, when you get your blood drawn by a nurse or a phlebotomist, they use one of these. This is called a vacutainer, which is a container filled with a vacuum. So when they take your blood, they stick the needle into the vein, they pop the vacutainer on there, and that vacuum is what pulls the blood into the tube. It's pretty brilliant. But in this one unique, incredibly specific case, that vacuum caused a tiny amount of the dimethyl sulfate to vaporize, and it poisoned 23 people. Because say it with me, folks, pressure changes everything. And this provides the last ribbon and the last bow to wrap up the mystery of Gloria Ramirez, the toxic lady. Of course, this theory has its detractors. Those who disagree with this theory point out the fact that dimethyl sulfate doesn't really hit people the way that it did the staff. It's really more like tear gas. So while the staff didn't start to cry from the vapors, they did report a burning sensation. And also usually its effects take hours for it to materialize, but the staff experienced it like immediately. For what it's worth, Ramirez's family isn't buying this theory either. They insist that she had never heard of DMSO, and they requested an independent autopsy 2 months after she died. But unfortunately by that point her body was extremely decomposed, and the heart and a lot of other organs were missing. Also apparently what was left was contaminated with fecal matter. So, yikes. This, of course, has led to a lot of speculation that the hospital was involved in some kind of cover-up. Maybe the wildest theory that's been floating around is that the hospital was manufacturing methamphetamines and smuggling it into IV bags, one of which was accidentally used on Ramirez. But in the end, so far anyway, the Livermore Labs theory is the most accepted so far. And it's got plenty of tests and experiments to back it up. But still, it's just a theory. We'll likely never know exactly what happened on that weird night in 1994. Luckily, nothing like that's ever happened since that we know of. Which actually does lead me to believe the DMSO theory. It was just such a unique set of circumstances. You know, everything had to be just right for it to happen. And I should probably close by recognizing that at the heart of this mystery is an actual person. Somebody who was probably a really good person and was tragically taken far too soon and is sadly remembered for this one single weirdest thing about her life, that being the way that it ended. So, rest in peace. All right, thanks to CuriosityStream for supporting this video, and a huge shout out to the Answer Files on Patreon who are keeping the lights on around here, forming an awesome community, and just being a great place for me to get feedback from people. I really do appreciate it. There's some new people I need to shout out real quick. We've got Joseph Kubertek, I think, Maria Hiller, Gangsta Jeebus, Charles Hicks, Charlotte, Captain Confused, Elena Staggs, Mark Ellison, Stephen Thurston, Kiyomi, Jan Ovansky, Christy Gates, Devin O'Donnell, Simon Simeon, Stacy Ivy, Matthew, Chris Bush, and Scary Miss Mary. Perfect for a Halloween episode. Well, thank you guys so much. If you would like to join them, get early access to videos, get access to exclusive live streams, and just be a part of an awesome community, just go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe. Please do like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, maybe check out this one. I'll put another mystery video up here that I've worked on. Maybe the Somerton Man video. That was a pretty popular one. Or you can check out any of the other little videos down here on the side that have my face on them. Check them out. If you enjoy them and you're not subscribed, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening and spooky happy Halloween this evening, and I'll catch you next time. Love you guys. Take care. Tsar Nicholas II. He was the last Tsar of Russia before the Communist Revolution. It was a time of danger and turmoil, especially for his family, so in his fear and desperation, he turned to an unusual source for comfort. An alcoholic homeless dude named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was like a self-proclaimed monk, often called the Mad Monk, and they said that he had mystical powers. He could heal the sick, predict the future. He had eyes that burn their way into your soul. And apparently he had a giant schlong. That's not relevant. As his influence over the royal family grew, so did the contempt for him amongst the nobles. And in December of 1916, a group of them led by Prince Felix Yusupov conspired to assassinate him. This was not going to be as easy as they thought. The plan was to lure Rasputin to the prince's palace and then poison him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine, which Rasputin eagerly devoured, and it did nothing to him. So they dispensed with the subtle route and just straight up shot him 4 times. Still didn't kill him. At this point, they were getting frustrated, so they each grabbed a club and proceeded to beat the crap out of him into a bloody pulp on the floor. Yeah, still not dead. Finally, they just tied up his hands and feet, rolled him up in a carpet, and dumped him in the river Neva. When his body washed ashore a few days later, they found that he had actually managed to escape his ropes and get out of the carpet before he did finally drown. Rasputin's stubborn unwillingness to die has become the stuff of legend, and it's often attributed to his mysticism. There's a metaphysical context usually applied to it, but there are many stories out there of people who have endured similar traumas, or worse, and lived to tell the tale. Last week we got dark AF talking about how a severed head could possibly remain conscious after being decapitated from the body, which somehow became a gigantic hit. One of the biggest videos I've ever done. Sickos. But let's go the other direction this week and talk about just how much damage the human body can attain and just keep on balling. Just a quick disclaimer, and I shouldn't have to say this, but don't try any of this at home. These are extreme examples of human endurance. The reason they're noteworthy is because in no way should these people have survived. So don't go all thinking you're immortal and jump in front of a bus or something. Again, I shouldn't have to say that, but Tide Pods. Also, fair warning, some of the details here, not for the squeamish. Number 5 on our list today is Todd Endress. Todd's story is amazing not just because of the injuries he sustained, but also just how he managed to survive. Todd was a surfer from California, and in 2007, the thing that all surfers fear the most happened. He got attacked by a great white shark. The shark attacked him from behind, getting hold of his back and tearing the skin, in Todd words, quote, like a banana peel. Dude got peeled like a banana. He clung to a surfboard for dear life as the shark came back around again. He was bleeding all over the water. The shark this time managed to bite on top of both him and the surfboard, Luckily, because he was holding the surfboard to his stomach, the bites did not perforate his stomach, but it did do more damage to his back. The shark then grabbed a hold of his leg and tried to tear that off, but he was able to free it by kicking at the shark's eyes and nose with his other foot, which eventually got the shark to go away. This, by the way, is exactly what you're supposed to do if you get attacked by a shark, so it does work. This bought him a little bit of time, but he was still pretty far from shore and he was losing blood, so things were still looking pretty grim. But then he got saved by, and apparently this is true, a herd of dolphins. A dozen or so dolphins swam up and encircled Todd, swimming around him, splashing in the water and deterring the shark, just giving him enough time to swim to shore and get some help. He survived. It took many months of painful rehab, but he did make a full recovery. Number 4 is Dante Atullo. Dante Atullo was building a shed in his backyard in Chicago when the nail gun misfired and bounced off the side of his head just above his ear. It bled a little, but it didn't really hurt that much, so he kind of just kept doing his thing. He finished his work. He even did a little bit of snow plowing and didn't bother to go to a doctor about it until he woke up the next morning feeling really nauseous. The doctor decided to do an x-ray of his head just to be safe, and he came back and showed him this. Dante actually started laughing when he saw this because he thought the doctor was playing a prank on him. Because, you know, doctors and their crazy pranks. Turns out the nail came millimeters from hitting his motor cortex, which would have left him paralyzed for life at best, dead for worst. And in case you're wondering how the hell he couldn't have felt a 3.5-inch nail in the middle of his head, it's because we actually don't have sensory neurons in our brains. So if it by some miracle misses any major arteries, which it apparently did in this case, the only place you would actually feel it is right there on the side of your head. The doctors removed it by making holes on either side of where it entered the skull and removed the nail and took out a piece of skull with it, and covered it with a titanium mesh. It was a 2-hour-long operation, but Dante made a full recovery and suffered no ill effects from his experience. Number 3 is Andrew Lin. If you ever feel like there's no good luck for you in this world, blame this guy, because he took a lot of it. Andrew had already had a few brushes with death. He was an Iraq War vet. He guarded military convoys over there and had already dealt with the explosions of some anti-personnel mines as well as IEDs, but he managed to come out of that unscathed. He came home and then in 2008 got hit by a drunk driver driving at 75 miles an hour. He somehow managed to survive that crash with a little neck injury that was easily corrected with minor surgery. So yeah, already a pretty lucky guy, but this was just the appetizer before the entree of holy shit. On the night of November 29th, 2010, Andrew got a little bit hungry, decided to go out for a burger, and on the way, he fell asleep and drove off the road into a chain link fence. Upon hitting the fence, the 2-inch diameter pipe at the top of the fence broke loose, went through his windshield, and went through his mouth. The pole went through his neck, exited out the back, pinning him to the seat and preventing him from moving. He remained conscious when the paramedics arrived and was even trying to text on his phone while they were cutting the bar loose to set him free. He even walked over to the ambulance on his own. Once at the hospital, the doctors took great care to remove the pipe. They had to give him a tracheostomy so that they could secure his breathing. They even had to pour cold water, ice cold water, down into the pipe while they cut it so that it wouldn't overheat and hurt his organs. They were concerned, of course, that the jagged edges on the pipe might nick an artery and cause some massive bleeding, but they were able to get it out without that happening. Somehow, this thing went through his neck without hitting his jugular or his carotid arteries. Andrew lost several teeth that had to be replaced, and his jaw was wired shut for a while, which took a lot of rehabilitation to get back into the swing of things, but yeah, he made a full recovery. The lesson here is if you're super tired and you want a burger, call Uber Eats. Number 2 is Peng Shilin. Peng Shilin is only 78 centimeters tall. That has not always been the case. Peng was a cop in the Shenzhen province of China when in 1995 a freight truck ran over him and sliced him in half. Sliced him in half. There are pictures online of the accident if you really want to go check them out. I will not share it here, but yeah, there's pictures. Somehow he managed to not bleed out at the scene. He was rushed to a hospital where he spent 2 years while doctors rerouted almost every single major organ and system in his body. Over time, he was able to build up strength in his arms and figure out how to take care of himself. He even managed to walk again through the use of this device that the hospital built that's basically like an egg cup with 2 bionic legs attached. He even went on to become a successful businessman and opened a bargain supermarket that he called, and I'm not making this up, the half-man, half-price store. Keep your eyes out for the lawsuit from Tyrion Lannister. And the last on this list is a certified badass of the highest order, Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wart. Sir Adrian de Wort was born into Belgian nobility in 1880, but despite the opportunity to live a life of luxury and travel and nothing but fun, he decided he wanted to fight for a living. As a teenager, he was sent to boarding school in England, where he lied about his age to serve in the British forces in the Second Boer War in South Africa. There he was shot twice, once in the groin and one in the stomach, before he was sent home. He continued serving the British military despite his parents' protests, first in South Africa and then in India, and then when World War I broke out, he was one of the first people to sign up to fight first in Africa. In an attack at an enemy fort in Shimber-Barras, which is in modern-day Somalia, he was shot twice in the face, losing an eye and part of an ear. Now, most people at this point might be thinking, okay, I've been shot 4 times in 2 battles, that's enough for me. It wasn't enough for him. He basically just went on a tour through Europe, making sure to get mutilated every place he went. While serving on the Western Front, he was shot in his hand, and famously, when the doctor refused to amputate his fingers, he bit them off himself. He got shot through both the skull and the ankle at the Battle of the Somme, through the hip at the Battle of Passchendaele, through the leg at Cambrai, and through the ear, again, at Arras. When asked later about his World War I experience, he said, quote, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." After the war, he served a British mission in Poland, supporting their conflicts with the Soviet states, where a plane he was in crashed, and he was taken prisoner of war. He was later released. When World War II broke out, after probably squealing with joy because he was a maniac, he served the British military and was shot down over the Mediterranean. Guess what? He survived that. Managed to escape the sinking plane, swam to shore where he was captured by the Italians and put into a prisoner of war camp where he spent 7 months digging a tunnel to escape, which he successfully did and managed to evade capture for 8 days while posing as an Italian peasant in the Italian countryside. He was later recaptured, but as a high-ranking officer and probably a major pain in the ass to the Italians, he was traded back to the English in a deal. After the war, he became an envoy to China, working one-on-one with Winston Churchill, and then he later retired to the Irish countryside where he died peacefully in his sleep in 1963 at the age of 83 years old. Top that! Actually, no, don't try to top that. Now, those are just 5 situations. Obviously, there are many, many other crazy stories of human survival that probably deserve a video all to themselves, but if you have a favorite, please feel free to share that in the comment below. I want to thank Jason Forbes for his help putting this video together. He's got an awesome channel himself called J Theory. You might enjoy it. Link right here. Please like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, please feel free to check out some of my other videos. I do videos on fun, random topics like this on Thursdays, more sciencey topics on Mondays, and if you like those, please do subscribe. All right, I thank you guys for watching. Have a good rest of the week, and I will see you here next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. This was a 3-hour video. Are you still watching? Seriously, I want to know who's actually watched this all the way to the end. Comment in the bottom in the comments with a banana emoji if you're actually watching. I just want to see how many people actually stuck around. My bet is like 60% of you are asleep right now. Nighty night. But if you did watch all the way through, no, I'm curious. Is this something you want to see more of? We're going to do a few more of these. Hopefully you enjoy them. Thanks for sticking around. I hope this was fun. I hope this was a nice little trip down memory lane, like I said at the beginning. Please check out hensonshaving.com because they're supporting this video and they make great stuff. Like it's a no-brainer. You'll save money and it's a better shave. That link's down in the description. Otherwise, thank you guys for watching. We got new stuff coming next week. We got some really big stuff on the way, which is why we're doing these. And trust me, it'll be worth the wait. I'm really excited about it. In the meantime, we got a new video coming out next Monday. You guys have a good rest of your week. And I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care.